Thank you for joining us. This is Roberto Suarez, the Secretary General of the IOE, the International Organization of Employers. This event is related to a very important topic from the situation that right now we are witnessing, which has to do with the COVID-19, but also with the way the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals are achieved, is how we really make a difference in the collaboration with the private sector, between the private sector and international organizations. This is linked to the high-level political forum that is taking now place in parallel, which normally takes place in New York physically, but this year, of course, is being taking place virtually. I think that for us as IOE, this is not just an event to discuss and to exchange, but also to deliver, to find ways to identify action-oriented points which help us as business community, but also to others, stakeholders, to move ahead the agenda of the SDGs. For this reason, I want to especially thank our partners, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and the Executive Director, Andrea, and all the persons that have been involved, and especially also to the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations, the Ambassador, Mr. Dr. Christoph Hönsgen, also who is joining us, because of all the support that they have given us also to organize and arrange this event. I have to be also very strict in terms of time managing because of the number of speakers, but also because of the interaction that we want to take. So please forgive me also in advance for being also strict in the time management perspective. I would start now also welcoming also the IOE President, and thank you, Errol, for joining us to give us some welcoming remarks. Errol, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this digital summit on Decade of Action on SDG Delivery, how to strengthen the partnership with the private sector. This digital summit is jointly organized by the International Organization of Employers, the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the UN. My name is Errol Kirisepi, and I am the president of the IOE. We have a very rich agenda in front of us, and on these 4 upcoming panels, we have very distinguished speakers. Our intention is not only to discuss and listen today, but to take action and build partnerships. Last July, when I came to New York for the high-level political forum, we discussed how we were behind in meeting the SDG targets. Now, with the COVID-19 crisis, we find ourselves even further behind in meeting those targets. We need to step forward and take these times to rethink and ask ourselves, how are we working and how can we build back better? The global community, business and other stakeholders are coming together to defeat COVID-19, but we must not lose sight of implementing the 2030 Agenda commitments to build more resilient economies and societies. The 2030 Agenda is a roadmap for truly effective responses to alleviate the economic, employment, and social impact of the crisis, to develop and deploy new healthcare solutions, and to lay foundations for a recovery that will reflect lessons learned from this pandemic and put us on track to sustainable development that leaves no one behind. The global COVID-19 response is now an imperative and overarching focus for the United Nations, as it is for global business. But business needs certain issues to be addressed. Business continuity through flexible and non-bureaucratic access to low-cost short and medium-term loans to overcome liquidity challenges. Employers and employment through reduced employment taxes or social security charges and extended temporary unemployment programs. Proper access to income support and social protection, and preventing or minimizing the disruption of supply chains which are critically important for the economy and employment. Well, this is quite an extensive list. We are at the IOE taking serious action during this period. Never have partnerships been more important than today. We need to make partnerships happen, and especially on the ground. That is why IOE, together with ITUC, industrial, multinational and local companies, national employer federations and trade unions, and the ILO, has launched the Call for Action in the Garment Industry. This is also the reason we are focusing on stronger engagement of resident coordinators with the local business communities, including IOE employer federations in some 150 countries. It is the time to mobilize all of society's actions and build partnerships for sustainable and a just recovery that leaves no one behind. Again, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to a rich and thought-provoking discussion. Roberto, I give you the floor again.
Thank you, Errol. His Excellency, the Ambassador of Germany, Mr. Christoph Heuschen, you have also the floor. Thank you again for joining us.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you to partner with you today. It's always a pleasure to work together with the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, and I'm very happy to have Mrs. Ostheimer here as well. And I was just listening very carefully to President Recipe. I hope I got the name right for his statement. Now, usually during the high-level week, the HLPF, the German mission here on UN Plaza, we are hosting site events. And we have done this during the last years, and this year we can't do it. We are here participating virtually, and it's really, really my pleasure. And I want to echo what the President just said, that we are already to a certain degree behind reaching the goals, the SDGs, and COVID-19 has put us behind. And we are unfortunately best placed here in New York to have followed this. We all saw the total breakdown of the economy here in the city. It was just something for those who have seen it, to see New York totally empty, to go during a week through empty streets, to see all the shops closed. This was something really, really special. And one can only imagine what that meant for business, for the people employed. Now, if you go through New York today, you see something which I find is close to what the theme here is, and this is partnership. New York continues to not allow indoor restaurants. So what did they do? The city, within a very short span, gave permissions to restaurants to expand their business on the streets of New York. When you go through First Avenue today or others, you see all these restaurants now on the streets. They got the permissions. You have people coming in, and at the same time, this I hope will also have an effect on other SDGs, not only getting now new employment, but then also shrinking the space for all the traffic, the car traffic, and having less their gas from cars there. So this is all about partnerships. Here you have the partnership of the city, of business and business organizations, and this is how we can cope with the COVID-19 crisis. This is how we can achieve all the SDGs. You can only do it with partnerships, and Germany has been participating in this. We have initiated various partnerships involving the private sector to accelerate implementation of 2030 agenda, the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, the Prevent Waste Alliance, the Initiative on Sustainable Cocoa, just to mention a few. We think that it is key that we do this, that we have this partnership, and that we as always, put a lot of emphasis on the respect for human rights. Next decade of business and human rights is something that we are actively committed to, and that we are working on. So we're starting the UN Decade of Delivery in Action to implement the SDGs. We need to further strengthen the partnerships. We all have an obligation and responsibility to engage, and therefore, again, thank you very much for having us co-hosting the event today, and we are looking forward to the discussions. Thank you very much for having us here.
Thank you to you, Ambassador. We're looking also forward to engage further with you. I now, Andrea Osterheimer, the Executive Director of the Adenauer Foundation.
Thank you, Roberto. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung to this virtual conference jointly hosted with the German Permanent Mission and IOE. And my particular thanks go to Ambassador Christoph Heusgen, the Permanent Representative of Germany to the UN, and the IOE President Errol Kirisepi. Together with IOE, we as Konrad-Adenauer Foundation hosted during the last weeks consultations with UN representatives, business associations, and private sector representatives. And at the center of our discussions has always been the question on how to strengthen the interaction with those stakeholders, which today, more than ever before, are key for any delivery on the SDGs. We need the private sector, and certainly today's interaction is a highlight of our cooperation, but certainly not the end of it. Also, private sector engagement is often seen as a way to mobilize much needed funding for the SDGs. It in fact is and has to be much more. The private sector is equally important for capacity building, for technology development, for skills and knowledge transfer. Private sector engagement for the SDGs really has to move beyond corporate social responsibility or charity. Private sector can push the agenda of government, and it can provide useful data for the right policy making. For example, we still see in many countries a gap between the skills the labor market requires and how the educational sector prepares for future generations. And if we talk about a new normal post-COVID-19, we also know that we will require new skills for many of the global workforce. Also, for the UN development system, the private sector needs to become a strategic partner. Although the current UN reforms mainly focus on internal structures and processes, I think the buildup of a new generation of UN country teams provides ample opportunities for thinking out of the box. The UN certainly has convening power, but it also needs to move away a little bit more from the current, much more project-centered approach. For a comprehensive approach on SDGs, macro-level discussions need to be facilitated, which also can allow the UN to become a strategic partner for governments in their strive for policy coherence. Ladies and gentlemen, the decade of action on SDG delivery will largely depend on all member states. Private sector engagement needs the support of national governments and donor countries. Therefore, I would like to thank particularly Dr. Ibrahim Mohamed Aval, the Minister for Business Development from Ghana, who is joining us today. But also a very special thank you goes to the German Vice Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Dr. Maria Flachsbart, for her support today, but also far beyond the discussion. Thank you, ministers. The manifold crises that we are facing today also underline that multilateralism in the 21st century has to shed off its mere intergovernmental character. It has to become a multilateralism that strengthens the relationships between state and non-state actors in order to further the common good and also the Agenda 2030. For us as a German political foundation, which is also strongly anchored in the concept of social market economy, it becomes very natural to facilitate this kind of dialogue and to serve as a builder of bridges between state and non-state actors. And I really hope that we will be successful in this today and that our discussions will move the private sector engagement to the next level. So I thank all of you for sharing your time, for sharing your expertise, and for participating in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I think also that I want to stress the high level component of the ministers also attending, but also of the coming panelists. I'll go ahead with the next panel and the first panel, which has to do with multilateralism. And it's quite contradictory because on one side, this COVID-19 crisis, which is not just a health, but economic and social crisis, is leading to a situation in which we really notice how important international organizations and multilateralism are. But on the other side, we do have to recognize that there is a kind of questioning of multilateralism that we have to cope with. So for that, we need a kind of strong approach also from the private sector on how to do it. And we want to build that relationship with help on a direction which is effective for the multilateralism. We have very reputed panelists in this panel. And the first one is the Secretary General of UNTACT. By the way, Mr. Kituyi, again, thank you, because it's not the first time that you join IOE in some of our events. We really appreciate the effort to join us. Such an important organization in the UN system has a key role to play also multilateralism. Perhaps the first question that I would have for you is, first, is multilateralism in crisis? And how we, the private sector, can work together to build stronger, resilient, and sustainable economies with international organizations? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for organizing this virtual meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, from the outset, I will say, yes, multilateralism is indeed in trouble. And if anything, the pandemic that we are going through right now has helped us to even see in a more clear way both the challenges that multilateralism is facing, but also the reality of our interdependentness, whether it is the rapid movement of personal protection gear across international borders, or medicines, or necessary emergency equipment. We are seeing an operation that has hit gridlock in many countries because of the absence of clear protocols on health and trade. And just shows how much a rules-based, predictable system is so important for efficiencies that go beyond trade itself. Now, this pandemic showed us that we need to recover better, that we were not on course to achieve Agenda 2030, that the decade of action has to correct and create a new normal, which addresses the challenges that were there before. And what does that mean? A clear understanding that one, a rules-based multilateral system is good for all of us. It has not been perfect. It needed to be debated on how to reform it, but reform is different from replace. Secondly, that new dynamics in the global economy call for a new engagement on how we can gain resilience and achieve the goals of Agenda 2030. For example, before the crisis hit us, global value chains were getting very major disruptions. A combination of technology and the rising economic nationalism was seeing the reorganization and disruption of global supply networks. Global value chains have been shifting in a way that it hasn't done, in a reverse order for quite some time, with reshoring and politically driven relocation of production agreements and networks. So what does it mean today? That one, the multilateral system, as was said just a few moments ago, requires a clearer embrace between the United Nations and international institutions and the business community. It is the business community which walks the paths of creating value. Two, that the vulnerabilities of the old system in multilateral benefits from multilateralism have to be addressed, particularly strengthening the stake and possibilities of the weak and vulnerable, particularly small island states, vulnerable maritime communities, least developed countries, developing landlocked economies. They need a greater attention, not just project level, as was said, but collectively. How can we improve on delivery and how can we improve on their engagement? The third thing is, with a shift in globalization showing some clear trends towards, for example, shorter supply networks, regionalization of multilateralism, and greater economic nationalism, incentives for investments and creation of jobs at home, efficiency-seeking FDI is declining as a phenomenon. International investment is much lighter-footed than before. Governments have to be assisted on how to adjust, for example, the industrial policies to be in line with this new reality. Countries which have been modeling industrial policies around special economic zones have to see that the zones of the future have to respond to more regionalized, more South-South, for example, coordination, and more optimizing domestic and neighborhood possibilities. So we shift economic focus from the just-in-time efficiencies of the past to a preparedness that you will call just in case, but also that is responsive to the new imperatives in place. Also, importantly, I think, our awareness from the pandemic that we need each other for sustainable recovery, that COVID is not defeated anywhere unless it's defeated everywhere, shows to our direction in the development and use of a vaccine that requires cooperation, and shows in a direction where we will need to build economic resilience capacities for vulnerable communities beyond their own abilities. So the discourse between the private sector, the public sectors, and international community is how can we find synergies to upscale best practice, to think of a new normal that mainstreams environmental concerns, social inclusion, and cures the vagaries of the old globalization. Thank you much for your attention.
Thank you so much to you. I think one of the points that you made is the COVID-19 needs to be defeated everywhere, not in an isolated manner, because then we will not, and that's becoming very, very, very obvious. I'll now give the floor to His Excellency, the Minister for Business Development of Ghana, Mr. Mohamed Awol. Perhaps you can illustrate us on how we can build a strong private sector PPPs, public collaborations in an efficient manner, precisely to bring the quick recovery that we are all looking forward, based on your experience in Ghana, a country who has been doing well in terms of dynamic economy and also growing sustainably in the last years. What's your guidance and what's your experience? If you can do that in 5 minutes, we'll be very much thanking you. I know that it's very challenging. And thank you again for joining us, Minister.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, and thank to CAF for this summit. For us in Ghana, the COVID-19 has been a very terrible experience. 80% of our businesses are small businesses. You can imagine the effect on them. Even before the COVID, these small businesses were living on fringe society. They were not resilient enough. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really affected us a lot. But it's not all lost. In as much as there have been a lot of disruption, we also see a lot of opportunities post-COVID. What we have to do is to strengthen public-private partnerships. It's very, very important for survival now and post-COVID-19. In Ghana, for instance, we have instituted a regular government-private sector meetings every quarter, chaired by the President of the Republic of Ghana. This is the private sector to make an input into how we can quickly recover from this pandemic and build a much more resilient economy. At such sessions, which is held quarterly, the President and the Vice President attends, the key economic ministers attend, like finance, business development, trade, and industry. We all attend. I think we need to have a new relationship between public and private sector, brought about by COVID-19. Need for new partnerships. A partnership that should help countries like Ghana, developing countries in general, to be able to build the economy through value addition. It's very important to add value. What the last 60, 70 years, all that we do is export our raw materials, sell them. It doesn't add value. Now we are naked. The only way we can go beyond it is to add value to our raw materials so we can get more money. Also in the third world, for instance, we have a very youthful population. 6% of our population is below 30 years. We need therefore both structures and initiatives that will build the productive capacity of the young people, and that is education. Our President Nana said, whilst we know how to build the economy, we cannot bring dead people back to life. It's very important for us to look at it. So we think that the pandemic has brought the necessity for all of us to chart a new course between the private and public sector, regular dialogues to list the private sector. The private sector can bring us skills, finance, and technology to help developed countries to go ahead. And I also think that this is a time for debt forgiveness. The pandemic has wiped everything that we've done in the last 3 years in Ghana. Our GDP growth used to be averaging 7% since 2017. This year, it might just be 0.9. And that's not good for us. So I think that we need forgiveness, developing countries. So we can start all over through private sector support in terms of technology, in terms of funding. And all the support should go towards youth development. In the third world, over 7% of our people are below 30 years. We therefore need quality education, technology, and funding to help youth-owned businesses to grow. This is the only way we can build it. And the pandemic is not going. We must learn how to live with it and make sure we defeat it. And the effects for us very, very more severe than any other part of the world, even though the debts are not as big as the developed world. But the stress on businesses is unimaginable. So I want to look at a new partnership between between public sector and private sector, and that private sector should have to bring financing, technology, and the discipline in public sector, and that the third world needs debt forgiveness. We can start all over and make sure build resistance. Otherwise, the digital goals have been affected. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Minister, for being also so concrete. Skills, finance, technology, and also the challenge of the debt. I think those are guidance that can be also very useful also for the future in future action-oriented collaboration. I want also to thank especially also Sanda Ogiambo. Sanda, you just have been appointed as Executive Director of UN Global Compact, and we are already exploiting you, if I may use these words, to a maximum. And so thank you so much for your commitment with us. I have two questions for you, because you and Global Compact also have a strong experience in partnering between the private and international organizations. Give us some hints on where the obstacles are, because we sometimes talk about the importance, but where are the obstacles, where are the challenges in these partnerships between the private sector and the international organizations, and also how we as employers and business organizations can complement each other with the UN Global Compact better. We have some projects with the UN Global Compact, like how can we do better? Thank you again, Sanda.
Great. Thank you, Roberto, and thank you for inviting me to this important forum. Greetings and salutations to my fellow panelists as well. Let me just reflect to when the UN Global Compact was founded by Kofi Annan. That was 20 years ago. And Kofi Annan clearly stated he was looking to initiate a global compact of shared values and shared principles to give a human face to a global market. And I think Kofi's vision was very inspirational, very aspirational. I think COVID, as Dr. Mukisa has also said, has really exposed what some of the fundamental challenges are to business and to multilateralism. Allow me by first saying, the UNGC is the world's largest corporate sustainability organization, and we work with about 10,000 businesses around the world in over 60 countries. We believe in 10 principles that I'll talk about as I answer your second question. Now, to your specific question on what I see as some of the challenges, I think one of the first things is it's evident unilateralism is not a long-term strategy for anything sustainable. And I think we have seen the impact on broken supply chains, we've seen the impact on closure of businesses, we've seen the impact of non-inclusive business decisions. I think business in a short-term view failed to make some critical decisions to allow us to properly respond to the COVID pandemic. One of the biggest challenges is business has actually had to move from a position of typically do no harm to one of elevated responsibility. And I think that is some of the positioning around business that Kofi Annan called for. And certainly when the SDGs were formed, the increasing call to action for business to really move from just doing business to looking at societal transformation. And I think some of those pivots and shifts are what are the long-term changes that really are required to position business better for the future. Allow me to just reflect on another key element, which is trust. Edelman recently released its trust survey in May 2020 during the height of the pandemic, and took a survey on what citizenry thought about business. And it was found that the public is expecting business leaders to play a much more responsive and leadership role around the COVID pandemic, and to focus on key issues such as labor rights and human rights. You know, typically economic growth fosters trust, but the challenge that business now finds itself in amidst economic stagnation and indeed decline is that trust is faltering. And trust then fosters inequalities that impact overall business outcomes. So I think the COVID pandemic has really highlighted what are some of the softer issues, but have actually given business either the opportunity to rise or to unravel. We believe at the Global Compact that our 10 principles, as well as the SDGs, really provide a solution for business to drive sustainable business. To your question about how business and employer organizations can partner better together, as you well know, Roberto, we have our 10 principles, and the 10 principles of the Compact really are grounded in labor rights, in human rights, in environmental stewardship, and in anti-corruption. And I think these 4 principles are a fantastic platform for collaboration, for genuine business transformation, and work with employer organizations. So it is one of the pillars along which we build our partnership with employer organizations, and we drive this message through our many local networks in countries around the world.
Very clear, Sandra. Thank you again, and we'll continue pushing this agenda together and jointly.
Thank you.
Tunsi, I told us that we were exploiting Sandra, but we are also exploiting you as IOA Vice President to the ILO. I have a very specific question to you. Social dialogue, how social dialogue can strengthen multilateralism, and vice versa, how multilateralism can strengthen social dialogue in the context of the UN reform. And you have been involved in many discussions on this area within the ILO, but also outside the ILO. Thank you again for joining us. Tunsi, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Roberto. It's lovely to see the brothers and sisters on the screen. The one, of course, that's been exploited a lot, I can agree, is my dear sister, newly appointed to the UN Global Compact. And I must warn you, once Roberto starts with his team, you're a permanent victim of this exploitation. So start joining a union or something. Colleagues, lovely to be with you. It's a great pleasure and honor to attend this conference alongside such a distinguished panel. A global crisis of monumental proportions, impacting lives and livelihoods of all is what we are currently facing. We've heard testimony from many people all over the world in the last 4 months to 5 months. However, to respond effectively, cooperation and coordination among international organizations, multilateral actors, and the business community is absolutely vital. Working together, we can save lives, restore livelihoods, and bring the global economy back on track. We must work together more urgently than ever we have before to minimize the health, economic, and employment impacts of this crisis. Multilateral stakeholders need to take action on labor market recovery now and ensure livelihoods are guaranteed in the long term. I mentioned last week we had a leaders summit at the ILO where we had over 60 presidents, heads of state, and other leaders, about 79 of us. And then the following day we had constituents, trade unions, governments, everybody. And one of the things I said at the time, and I repeat today, is that it's time to think bold. It's time to think different, and more importantly, think big. It is time to innovate new policy approaches, recommendations, and processes to reinvigorate multilateralism and make it fit for the current global needs and demands. The core of the future should be based on social dialogue, which will also need to be realistic, innovative, and forward-looking, for indeed this bold new future will define how we build back better. There's no doubt on the key role that social dialogue plays on the recovery. The crisis response has demonstrated its undisputed value. However, it is true that social dialogue is not utilized to its full potential. It is necessary to look more comprehensively on the contribution that social partners have to offer regarding the economic recovery and how public and private sectors can leverage their respective efforts. We need to become much more strategic in these partnerships. Each player brings his or her own competitive advantages into a partnership to create the biggest possible impact. An enabling environment for social dialogue in its institutions needs to be strengthened now more than ever so that we can find sustainable solutions for the recovery. Multilateral institutions are the forum to make this happen at the level that the current global needs demand. Multilateral actors have a key role to play in the recovery process and to build back better. Much is expected from multilateralism. The pressure is not only on social dialogue, but in multilateral institutions as a whole to respond timely and effectively. Therefore, responding to the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 needs a stronger engagement between the UN and the representative employers and business federations. The UN reform has placed a great responsibility on resident coordinators, and they have a key role to play on this task. They've become a bridging element for social partners' engagement at national level. Regional coordinators shall be facilitators of a stronger engagement with social partners. The success of their function will strongly rely on the impact they can achieve at national level. Ensuring policies for a fast recovery are designed for effective implementation cannot be achieved if social partners are not involved. National federations worldwide have the representativeness and legitimacy as the consolidated voice of business in shaping policy. Moreover, despite the enormous pressure that the crisis has put on the sustainability of enterprises, businesses stand at the forefront of the finding of solutions to mitigate the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In conclusion, Roberto, we remain 100% committed to work on the recovery, economic recovery of our nations and the realization of a better world after the pandemic. We look forward to strengthening our partnership with the UN as well as any other stakeholders at the global level. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Mtunzi. I now give the floor to Renat Hornundraus, who, apart from being the managing director of the German Employers Association, the BDA, is our vice president for Europe. And precisely in relation with multilateralism, how can is there any need to reinvent multilateralism, or there are things that can be handled in a different manner? And how and you have a strong experience in European social dialogue, and also the European social partners also have a strong experience also in terms of providing solutions and action-oriented deliverables. How we can bring that to this new equation that we are trying to get from COVID-19. Renat, can you hear us? Hello? I don't know whether there is any connectivity challenges. Okay. If it is not the case, we have two questions in the chat function. One has to do with SMEs and UNTAC, and I would like to ask again the Executive Director of UNTAC very quickly, you can just give us some hints on what you as UNTAC are doing and how you are approaching the SME element. And then there was another question to the Global Compact, to Sanda, on how countries like Bangladesh, and he was our Executive Director of Bangladesh, can help also in areas and in developing economies with such huge challenge linked to the COVID-19. I don't know whether you can quickly answer that before we go to the next panel.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, everybody knows, and it has been particularly demonstrated with the crisis, that the SMEs are the main providers of employment in many of the countries, both developed and developing. And therefore, any recovery strategy must be about building new resilience and building a revival for SMEs. This includes diversifying the portfolio of what they do and how they do it. A number of things are very important. Digital platforms are the new opportunity and vehicle for the next services from small and medium enterprises. Secondly, governments must go beyond resourcing how to revive big business and look at how can we build capacity for small enterprises, particularly in the sectors that have been most hit hard, like hospitality industry, the transport industry, and those linked to global value chains that are being shifted by geopolitical dynamics and changed circumstances because of reshoring of production. How can we give meaning to new opportunities? How can we build new electronic market visibility? As an organization, one of our most successful programs, Empretech, targets building entrepreneurial competencies and market intelligence for small businesses run by vulnerable groups, particularly from among women and youth. And we find it one of the areas where the absorption of new innovative business approaches and new linkages to new opportunities has to be focused as part of the recovery strategy.
Thank you. Sandra, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, my colleague from Bangladesh. I think Mukisa has actually highlighted a few of the areas around rebuilding, because some of the rebuilding in a lot of the countries where Global Compact works really has to hinge on the SME sector. You know, what I would add is we really need to look at a very inclusive approach to this business recovery. And a key element also is actually the element of sustainable financing and inclusive financing models. I think the recovery from COVID is really going to require flexibility around access to credit, access to finance, and also a very inclusive approach to how a lot of the economic stimulus packages are applied across countries. To the specific question about the Global Compact, I think Global Compact members play a key role in translating our global messages into local solutions. As you know, we always talk about the SDG ambition and using the SDGs as a way of recovery and addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. But we look for practical, implementable business solutions that can really drive economic growth forward. I think also hinging on the 10 principles is critical. But going back to 3 key things, we need inclusive business solutions, we need sustainable and accessible finance, and we need to consider growing back in a very green and sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Sandra. Renat, I think that you can now talk because perhaps you were muted. Can you try again? Okay. Well, we'll try to bring you back after if there is any slot. So
Roberto, you're muted.
So thank you so much to all the panelists. We are now moving to the next panel, which is also a quite relevant and important theme. And we have James Pearsall, the Executive Director of the Australian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, who is also a member of IOE and very active member. James, the floor is yours.
So easy to forget to unmute, and welcome to all of our colleagues across the world. I suspect that I am the one nearest to the dateline at the moment here in Canberra in Australia. While COVID-19 has had an appalling effect, a terrible effect on so many lives and on so many employers and employees across the world, one of the things it's also done is it's made it harder for us to get together in one place. And it's a very good thing that we are all working so hard to try and connect and stay connected through the use of technology. And can I appreciate the work of the IOE? Can I appreciate the initiative of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung? And can I acknowledge the contribution of the mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United Nations in facilitating the session and helping to bring all of us together. The Sustainable Development Goal 8 around decent work and economic growth remains a key priority, and the challenge has only become even more intense as a result of the pandemic. And indeed, in many countries, including my own in Australia, the issue has become not so much one of decent work, but one of any work at all. And a great challenge, I think, will be to make sure that we retain a focus on the decency of employment and still drive towards our ambition of full employment for all women and men across the planet by 2030, notwithstanding that that goal has clearly suffered an enormous setback. And let's remember too that in order to have decent work, we need to have a prosperous private sector. And the quality of jobs that we can create will depend on the prosperity of the private sector. It's about engaging with social partners, it's about business continuity, it's about addressing the issues in the informal sector, it's about skills development, and it's about social protection. And thinking again about my own country, Australia, and the work that we do, can I say that this theme of collaboration and partnership is actually very much to the front of mind. And tomorrow morning, I will be taking part in tripartite negotiations with the Australian Trade Union Movement and with the National Australian Government, and I will be there representing Australian employers as we seek to drive towards the national goal of saving jobs and creating jobs. The government in Australia has set out a plan called Job Maker. Its aim is to do as its name suggests. It's to make jobs. And part of the task we'll be involved in tomorrow, our negotiating team, is to do just that, to collaborate with the trade union movement and the government to find a way to do just that. I'm delighted that today we have 5 speakers who will be able to discuss various dimensions of the particular challenge that we have in our efforts to create decent work at the same time as drive economic recovery, and to make sure that the two things go hand in hand. We will be hearing from Maria Flachsbart, the Vice Minister of the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We'll be hearing from our good friend, our old friend Guy Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization. We'll be hearing from Monica Flores-Varaguen, who is the President of Manpower in Latin America, one of the world's largest staffing firms. We'll be pleased to hear too from Johnny C. Taylor, who, as head of SHRM, is head of the world's largest human resources profession or association. And finally, our good friend and IOE Vice President, Alexandre Fuvlan, from the Brazil Employer Federation, will give us his perspective. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Flachsbart to take the floor.
So thank you very much, Mr. Pearson, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to discuss with you how we can get the world back on work after COVID-19. But it is clear that our priority at the moment must be to help people to continue to earn a living during this crisis. Countries in all parts of the world reacted with economic lockdowns in order to stop the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. This resulted in a sharp rise in unemployment, in underemployment, and, of course, poverty. The World Bank expects the global economy to shrink by 5.2% and global extreme poverty to increase by 100 million only this year. Vulnerable groups like people in informal employment are particularly affected by the pandemic. According to UNDP, nearly half of all jobs in Africa might be lost. While poverty and bad working conditions are not just a burden on those affected, they also promote the spread of the virus. Therefore, social and ecological standards must play an important role in the recovery. The 2030 Agenda is our compass to help policymakers meet urgent needs while pursuing long-term climate and sustainable development objectives. We need to build back better. We know that the virus and its economic and social consequences can only be defeated together and on a global level, or not at all. This is why the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, has taken vigorous measures from the beginning of the crisis to help our partner countries to deal with the effects of the pandemic. The needs are enormous. We responded early. In April, we restructured the 2020 budget to earmark 1 billion euros for a comprehensive emergency COVID-19 support program. With that program, we cover 7 areas. First, health and pandemic control. Second, food security and basic food services to prevent hunger. Third, stabilization of fragile regions affected by displacement. Fourth, social protection and securing jobs in global supply chains. Fifth, additional economic support for enterprises in key industries such as textile and tourism. And sixth, government liquidity. And seventh and last, international cooperation. As you can see, social protection and securing jobs in global supply chains are marked as priority in the COVID-19 support program, but also support for enterprises. I want to illustrate this by a few examples. First, with our special initiative on training and job creation, we are promoting private investment activities by companies that have a high employment impact in 7 African partner countries. We not only focus on creating more jobs, but also on improving labor conditions and incomes. As a response to the pandemic, we have expanded activities to ensure job retention as well. We are currently refocusing the support we provide to enterprises in order to secure investments and jobs in our partner countries. One project under the initiative is the Tunisian Automotive Management Academy. It offers training to middle managers to help companies in the Tunisian automotive sector expand their production and create 7,500 additional jobs. To ensure that training institutions can continue operating during the crisis, we support the short-term switch to digital content. In Ethiopia, for example, production has been switched to making masks and camp beds for use within the country. This will preserve the jobs of about 21,500 female textile workers. 21,500 female textile workers. Our COVID-19 response is not limited to bilateral messages, but we work very closely with our international partners such as ILO. We share the ILO's views that the only way to overcome the crisis is to revive the economy in a way that focuses on jobs. This means targeted and flexible measures to support employees and companies, especially in the informal economy and in micro, small, and medium-sized companies. The ILO rightly emphasizes that compliance with international labor standards, the protection of workers in the workplace, and social dialogue must be a part of this measure. As an example, the BMZ is funding an ILO project that promotes decent work in agribusiness in Morocco and Ethiopia. This includes measures to help 100 enterprises retain jobs. These are examples of the BMZ's response to COVID-19 crisis. We also in the progress of adapting next year's plans to the global crisis situation, and I'm now looking forward to the contributions of the other panelists. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister, and I hope you can stay with us until the second part of our session, when we'll have the opportunity to answer some of the questions from our participants. Right. And now I'm looking forward to introducing the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Guy Ryder. Guy, it's good to be able to connect with you again. I can only imagine that, like the rest of us, you are as busy as anyone can be. And critically, I'd like to ask you to tell us how the new normal equates to, or can equate to, sustained, inclusive and sustainable growth, as well as full and productive employment, as well as decent work for all. And we'd be very interested to understand how the ILO can assist its tripartite constituents to navigate through this crisis. Its role has probably never been as important as it is today.
Well, thank you very much, James. Greetings to fellow panelists and to everybody online, and thanks for your rather challenging questions, if I can say so. Can I just say a word about the new normal? It's not a phrase I much use or much like, because it contains within it a whole series of assumptions that we at least need to think about. I think there is the feeling out there that the pandemic, by definition and regardless of what any of us might like or want, is going to create something substantively, qualitatively different, and I speak here of the world of work, than that which existed previously. And that's a debate that we need to have in itself. And the first distinction I would make in that regard is, you know, those things that we will be obliged to adjust because we're living with a virus, we're living in a pandemic, but presumably looking a little bit further over the horizon, we might hope that there will be a situation where we have found a vaccine or therapeutics, whatever it might be, that means we're in a position to design what we want the future of work to look like, not simply to submit to the obligations that come from the existence of a pandemic. So the new normal, I guess my point here, James, is the new normal is out there for us to create, to construct, to build. Let's not fall into the trap of a certain paralysis in our thinking that we don't have any choices. We will have plenty of choices. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, and you know, I think we do need to place this discussion in the framework of the United Nations 2030 agenda, where, if you like, you know, 5 years ago, we said what we wanted the future of work to look like, and we had those 17 goals. We have the goal of full and productive employment and decent work for all, inclusive growth. I think that that objective still remains as the signpost, as the guiding star of the direction that we need to move in. But it's an important thing that everybody rededicates themselves to the achievement of that objective. So how do we get there? Well, the first thing to say is it would be nice if we could start from somewhere different from where we are today, because the reality is I can see no way that this could not be true, that let's say by the end of this year, whenever we start to emerge from the first wave, at least of the pandemic, it will be in a world where unemployment is higher, where poverty is higher, where inequality is higher, where debt is higher, and probably where political anger and frustration and tension will be higher. And that's a pretty unpromising place to begin from. And the new normal will have to start with getting us out of that enormous hole, probably, you know, the worst recession of modern times. And it really makes no sense, I think, to imagine a distant objective of a new normal without turning first to how we're going to get ourselves out of the drama that we're in. And as I think the Vice Minister was saying, the ILO has already, in the short term, advocated what needs to be done. We need to use all of the fiscal and monetary instruments at our disposal to stimulate economic behavior. We need to target support to enterprises to make sure that viable enterprises do not become victims of this pandemic, to support jobs and incomes, keep people attached to the world of work. Obviously, we need to protect workers. There can be no trade-off between health and employment and growth. The two things go together. We'll achieve both or we'll achieve neither. And lastly, and in the context of this particular panel, James, I think social dialogue, the interaction of business, organized labor and government is going to be of fundamental importance. And I think in your country, for example, and in many others, we've seen recourse being had very successfully, making a crucial difference to that type of interaction. I hope that won't be just a crisis response. I hope it will be a reflex that will stay with us in the longer term. It's really important. And then we've got some tough calls coming up, and I think they're going to come sooner rather than later. Firstly, we've got to get the sequencing and the balance right as we seek to unlock all around the world, whether it be in Melbourne in your country, whether it be in a German meatpacking house, whether it be in Leicester in my country. If we don't do things right, we're going to go back into the depths of this crisis. So we've got to get that balance right. And that means that those responsible for business, for the world of work, have got to interact with policymakers in other spheres. Something we're probably not that used to doing in many regards. Secondly, our chancellors, our ministers of finance are going to have a look at the accounts pretty quickly, aren't they? And they're going to say, How long can we keep these furloughs going? How long can we keep technical unemployment schemes going? How do we taper them off? To what extent do we preserve what we've had already at the risk of them becoming, as the common parlance is, zombies? And how much do we move people on to the next job, companies on to the next activity? That agility is going to be tested. And I think, and this is perhaps my most heartfelt point, James, we've got to work on our international cooperation. You know, in contrast, I'm afraid, to the crisis of 2008, 9 and 10, where the G20 was created in its current form and saved us from the worst, let's be honest. They prevented us going back to the 1930s by keeping the financial system going. You know, that international cooperation has not been present, or at least not in the same degree, as we search for the global responses to this self-evidently global crisis in which we find ourselves. We need to do better in that regard. We need to work together. We need to help out those countries which have got the least resources to deal with problems which are probably even greater than those of other countries. So these are the things that we have to put together. There are a few of my somewhat disjointed thoughts about the situation we find ourselves in and where we might find ourselves going next. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Guy. And again, hopefully you can stay, because I've no doubt that the challenges that you've set out to us will produce some interesting responses. And I appreciate the reference to Melbourne, where I have several members of my team, and as you can imagine, as I'm sure it's the same for all of you, my thoughts are with them constantly as they're dealing with the difficulties that they face there. I'd now like to turn to our third guest, Monica Flores-Varrigan, who is the president of Manpower Group in Latin America. I'm very interested to know how private employment services can drive a healthy and resilient labour market and economic recovery. And what do you think are employers going to need in order to play their role in restarting and recovering against increased uncertainty?
Thank you everybody. I'm very glad to be here in this interesting panel with all these, my colleagues participating with very challenging question I need to address. Well, we need to start thinking that employers are in different situations right now. Most of them are reacting, and probably some of them are recovering. But we need to start thinking in the reinvention of the world of work, because for sure it's not going to be how it was before the pandemic. Can we put all the slide, please? We have several blocks in which we need to think. One is physical and emotional well-being of our employees. We've talked about that in other panels, but we need to think in all the protocols that need to be in place in order to prevent or control the pandemic. Smart working with alternative work models. I'm going to talk more about this later. Digital communication, and thinking that flexibility is going to be the rule for this world of work. Cybersecurity, we need to invest in to control this risk, because it's what is affecting most of the companies now, where the employees are working from home without all the infrastructure that we had in the offices. And thinking more on what workers want, because we will face a scarce of talent, not thinking in people as talent, thinking in the skills that are needed in these new models. So we need to think how we can attract and retain the skills that we need to be competitive in this new normal or new reality. Protocols, as I've said before, and skills revolution. We need to invest in upskilling and reskilling our talent and the talent in general. That we can do by investing from our own money as companies, but we need to interact with governments and international organizations to invest in the right kind of training. Fast training, not for young people, but for elder people. If not, we are going to face very big social problems. Digital skilling, virtual learning will be the norm, and we need to be clear that if we don't change our mind as governments, companies, or individuals, we are going to be out because the knowledge will be obsolete faster than ever. And then the last block is going to be digital leadership. From the top of the companies, the top of the governments, and the top of the organizations, we need to set adaptability as the main ability that we need to have, and we need to reinvent everything, not just job descriptions. We need to reinvent the relationship between employer and employee, because we need to be aware that the 40-hour week with hours of commute will be something from the past. We need to think in sourcing and demand skills from anywhere and from any country. We need to create cross-functional, cross-country collaborations among many cultures to be aware and to be ready to the market demands. People will be need to provide adaptability, tech safety, as I say, and speed of learnability. We need to work with schools and educational institutions to create fast training in the way that we need for different demographic groups. We need to reshape the future of this model to be more flexible, more trusting. We need to create a purpose in companies in order to have the right talent at the right moment. As it was said before, we need to work in diverse models of work, not only thinking in gender inclusion, but thinking in elder people inclusion, other religions inclusion, and other ethnics inclusion. Sometimes I think that we don't need to think in a new normal. We need to set our mindset in temporary normals. The change is going to be the normal, if I can say that. Social distancing, intensified of hygienic procedures, personal protection, it's gonna be the rule, and we need to invest on that. And it is important that ILO and the World Bank strive the same levels of protections for all workers, because not all the companies are in the same track. As a staffing company, we are part of the World Employers Confederation, and we work in a practical guide to a safety restart with the best practices from all around the world. And in, for example, Coparmex, that is one of the main employers organizations in Mexico, we are also working in implementing these kind of guides, which will ensure a safety return. But the challenge is not the return. The challenge is the reinvention of the future of work with these points that I have just mentioned. And for sure, just to finish my participation, dialogue is going to be the key. But I would add dialogue and execution, because sometimes ideas are there, the playbooks are there, the guides, the protocols, and the documents are pretty well done. But what we need to drive is execution at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And you've laid out a great number of challenges there. And anyone, I think, who had in mind that this was a complex problem, that a simple solution would suffice, would be well and truly of a different view, having seen your presentation. It raises a number of questions in my mind, and pleased to see that there are already some questions coming in to ask of you in a little while. I'd now like to invite Johnny C. Taylor, who is the head of SHRM. It's the world's largest association dedicated to the human resources profession, and be interested to know if you're able to share with us any successful strategies, examples of returning to work that works well, and give your insights in how employers and HR managers in particular can navigate, can adjust to the new realities that we're coming to grips with.
Well, thank you for having me here. Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Johnny Taylor. First, quick shout out to Director General of the IOE, Roberto Suarez Santos, as well as Guy Ryder, the Director General of the ILO. I look forward to seeing both you gentlemen in November, assuming we're allowed to travel. You know, this is a really interesting conversation, particularly given what's going on in the United States. Let me start with, I agree with the prior three comments. Everything that they've said is absolutely accurate. And frankly, that's part of the downside of being number 4, number 5, is everyone has said what you were going to say. I think, though, one of the things that we are learning here in the United States, we began bringing people back to work as late as, or I should say as early as 6 weeks or so ago. As soon as there was a break, some of our, let's start with a significant portion of our population were essential workers. And we broadly defined essential workers in the US. It wasn't just healthcare workers and law enforcement workers. It included some retail operations so that people could eat. Think about grocery stores, certain restaurants. A lot of the hospitality industry, while shut down, we still flew airplanes. We didn't shutter air traffic in the United States. And that's because with 50 different states, they all have their own governors and they're allowed to have differing rules. So we didn't officially shut down. So we have some pretty good experience with how different companies and different employers have operated through this. I'm going to share with you what we know to be some best practices. Again, about 6 weeks ago, Boeing, the Boeing company, the big manufacturer, equipment, large-scale aircraft manufacturer, et cetera, brought back 57,000 employees, or 27,000 employees, I'm sorry, to its workplace. And that was nearly 5, almost 6 weeks ago. They brought them back to Washington State. Washington State, different from Washington, D.C., is on the west coast of the United States, upper northwest. And frankly, that was the epicenter of the United States. That's where, because of a nursing home, we saw a ton of deaths. And so this was the epicenter. And to think that they were already bringing employees back, large scale, back to work, we began studying them. We've also monitored what our retail businesses have done with their employees. And there are a couple of themes that have arisen out of that. The number one is that this is as much about a crisis of confidence of our employees, about employers, as it is about the healthcare problem. So what we're finding is that so many of our employees are concerned about their safety, and they're not convinced that their employer is either concerned enough or has answers to those. So one of the big lessons that we've learned from employers here is you've got to communicate. You've got to communicate and over-communicate, send all sorts of signals of safety. That's a phrase that we use, signals of safety to your employees. So what does that mean? Right after 9/11, for those of us who go back to September 11th in the United States, there were people who totally suggested that air travel was done, that Americans would not get back on airplanes no matter what. What the United States government realized is that it had to signal safety, and thus we set up the Transportation Safety Administration, Security Administration, TSA, so that we were sending the message to travelers that we had this under control, that we had in place protocols to protect you so that traveling was actually safe again. In that same vein, employers are learning in this post-COVID world, and I don't know that it's even post-COVID yet, but in our COVID world, COVID-19, that we have got to signal to our employees that the workplace is safe. We can't guarantee safety, and we've never been able to guarantee safety at workplace. If one thinks about it, we've had cases of workplace violence. There's never been a 100% safe workplace, but signals communicating that we can do our best to create a safe work environment for you matter. It's not enough to have good protocol and PPE and all of those things that we all know we have to do. We have to actually convince our employees that the workplace is a fairly safe place for them to return. That's number one. Number two, and you cannot underscore the importance of educating your workers. Unfortunately, the media has sent them all sorts of messages, social media being the worst of them, about what's safe, what's not safe, how the disease can be transmitted, who's exposed. And people are focusing, for example, on the number of people who test positive, not hearing on the other side the fatality rate, the mortality rate, I should say. And those are the things that we as employers have to be engaged in. We have to speak to the scientific community and communicate to our employees fact versus fiction. There are too many really bad rumors, things that they're not based in truth at all, and employees are concerned about it. I heard someone the other day say to us, in fact, in our workplace, when you turn on the air conditioning, if one person has COVID or has a cold, it goes through the building and everyone's now sick. You may think, those of us who are better educated on this issue may know that's sort of absurd, but you shouldn't assume that your employees aren't receiving this information from all sorts of different media, some reputable and some not so reputable, and that is creating fear and uncertainty. And so what we know is no matter what kind of protocol you have in place, PPE, taking temperatures, giving out gloves, masks, all of those things, if your employees believe that the air conditioning in the system puts them at risk, if your employers believe that if they come by a doorknob 10 minutes after someone who had COVID touched it, that they are at risk, you're not going to get their confidence. This is an issue of regaining the confidence of your employees. The final point that I'll raise is how important it is to be flexible. And I know that Monica just said that, but it's really important. We have to change the way we operate. So big question here about whether or not schools are going to open. And if it's not complicated enough that we have 50 states, each of those 50 states have counties, provinces, jurisdictions, et cetera. And so some jurisdictions, right here in Virginia, some school systems are open, some aren't. So, you can't have a blanket rule for employees who have children, because some have children who are attending schools that are open. Some have intermittent openings. And so school is on Monday and Wednesday for people whose last names are A through M and N through Z are Tuesday and Thursday, and everyone on Friday. So this requires that we as employers take into consideration on a very individualized level what our employees are experiencing and what we need to do to bring them back to work and be sensitive to their personal issues. So, the takeaway is communicate, educate a lot about what this COVID-19 is doing to us, and every day the scientific community learns something different, and then be incredibly flexible.
Well, thank you, Johnny. And I don't know if everyone else was doing what I was doing, but I was taking notes down there, and I was thinking about the fact that I have my weekly meeting with all of my team tomorrow. They're both here in Canberra, and they're also in other locations, including, as I mentioned, some of my team are in Melbourne, which is in lockdown. And I agree. I've seen that level of nervousness, of anxiety. I've seen it in that some people just will not come back to the office, while others are happy to. I've seen it in the nervousness that people exhibit when they, as you say, when they turn the door handle and they go straight to the hand sanitizer dispenser. Fortunately, some of these things have become routine, and I think people don't think about them so much now. They've become a habit. But that erosion of confidence in personal safety I see around me, and I know that Australia is much less affected than many other countries who are represented on this call. So I think you've struck a chord with your comments there. And again, looking forward to our discussion soon. Finally, and before we go to our chat, which I'm very much looking forward to, I'd like to call on Alexandre Fuvler from the Brazilian Employers Federation, who is also the Vice President of the International Organization of Employers. And Alexandre, I'd like to know what you think about what a new normal, a better normal might look like from an employer's point of view, what kind of support are employers going to need, and what role can employers' organizations at the local, at the national, and even the international level play, in your opinion?
Thanks, James. Good morning, Americas. Good afternoon, Africa and Europe. Good evening, Asia and Oceania. My compliments to everyone with wishes of great health. I begin by pointing out the COVID-19 pandemic has led not only to a public health or economic crisis, but also to a crisis that affects the core of society, as it impacted, or rather is impacting, our relationships, such as personal, consumption, and labor relations. And we have been seeing this on a daily basis when we are required to come up with innovation, when we hold online events like this one, or when we foster different forms of work, such as the home office option. However, the economic effects of the pandemic are also catastrophic, with the risk it poses of extremely poverty and increasing inequalities throughout the world. Remember, some data allows us to put the situation we are experiencing today in perspective and places us at the starting point of searching for the best normal. As we know, the World Bank estimates that the global economy will shrink around 5% this year. In Latin America and Caribbean, the estimate points to 7.2% decline. As everyone knows, this decline translates into difficulty for companies to remain in operation, which in many cases have led them to close down altogether. And the consequence is a tsunami of extinction of jobs, lack of entrepreneurial and work opportunities, and increasing inequalities around the world. A global recession is at the doorstep, and if vigorous action is not taken to address it, the situation may remain unchanged for years to come. We must act now and fast. Companies must play a key role in the recovery process and in creating jobs, as well as in investing and promoting innovation so as to boost our economies. At this moment, I believe it's necessary to give priority to the premise of corporate sustainability as one of the benchmarks of a new and better normal. The sentences, "without companies, there is no work, no jobs," has become even more real today. For employers, a better normal means an environment that enables the private sector to thrive and innovate. It should enable companies to step up their investments in better technologies and to become more productive, sustainable, innovative, and competitive. This will make it possible for them to create more and better jobs and to play the role of agents of equal opportunities. In this scenario of a better normal, laws, policies, international agreements, and public infrastructure should facilitate rather than hinder the circulation of products or services along their domestic and global value chains, leaving behind rigid laws that hinder the development of company, slowing down as results the creation of higher quality jobs. This premise of sustainable companies must therefore, more than ever, stimulate entrepreneurship and contribute to improving the business environment and consequently to creating more jobs with equal opportunities for all workers. We need stability or predictability in relationships in favor of investment and innovation. For this purpose, governments should facilitate and encourage business continuity and recovery by investing in productivity, growth program, removing barriers to financial aid, and ensuring fiscal and monetary policies are redesigned to promote a rapid recovery. This time has come for us to build a better future and a better normal together. Government, employers, and workers must, on an urgent basis, work in partnership to discuss a strategic plan for rapid recovery and for building a better future. And violent social dialogue and tripartism is part of this path. An employers' organization can play a key role in this path in rebuilding our economies and societies. they can and they should act as leaders and effectively support a process for building resilience and supporting a sustainable and inclusive recovery. However, to fulfill this role, employers must be fully engaged nationally and internationally in negotiation, implementing, and monitoring the response to the crisis through social dialogue processes. The IOE has a key role to play in all of this, as it can, for example, maintain a strong and coordinated skills governance system through its active participation in national and sector skills council to ensure that educational and skills training programs are in line with the needs of the labor market. Ensuring this alignment between skills and needs is essential for companies to change their business model according to the new realities brought about by the pandemic. There is much more to be debated, but I will wrap up my presentation by summarizing an idea for a new and better post-pandemic normal. Companies should play a key role in the work agenda for resuming and recovering economic activity and jobs, with a focus on stimulating entrepreneurship, investment, and innovation. In short, we must innovate with a focus on better and equal opportunity for all. And all of this can be achieved through constructive work and in partnership by means of dialogue and strengthening tripartite. We have many challenges to face, but I'm sure that by working together, we will be able to achieve a better normal. Thank you very much, James.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandre, and listening to you, it's like listening to the agenda that my organization representing employers here has in Australia, and I'm sure it's resonating with other employer representatives on the call this evening and this morning, depending on where we are. Look, we're fortunate in that because we started early and you've all as speakers been absolutely ruthlessly efficient with your time, that we've got a good amount of time now for discussion. I'd like to make the most of that. And Maria, if I may go back to you, you've been listening patiently and I'm sure reading the chat. There was a question specifically for you, Maria, about what sectors does the BMZ support? And I'd like to add to that, are you doing anything to support demand? Because as one of our participants has pointed out, in order to create business activity and therefore create and sustain jobs, there needs to be demand for businesses to fulfill, to respond to. So my question is, on behalf of the group, what sectors is the BMZ's program supporting, and are you doing anything to try and support or even create demand?
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. Within this discussion, I have the impression that we are discussing in different worlds. You know, the one world is that world of our Western community. It's in the US, it's in Australia, it's in Europe. But the other world is the world of our partner countries, discussing the crisis in Africa or in Latin America. Is, you know, it's something else. It's on the one hand, it's a health crisis, of course, but on the other hand, it's a crisis of hunger. The people who have to experience a lockdown, they just have no chance to earn the money for food. So to discuss whether we should do something with demand is, I think it's not the question in our partner countries. There's a huge demand. There's a huge demand for food, a huge demand for health services, a huge demand for protection clothes, for masks, for soap, for you know, for all these very, very basic, very, very essential things. And we try to help to fulfill this huge demand. So when we support parts of industry, industrial sectors. It's the textile industry, because they are able to produce protection clothes, masks, for example. We support agriculture, all parts of food chains, and of course we support the health system. We try to strengthen hospitals, for example. We intended to use BV systems for the education, for vocational training. And now we use these systems to strengthen hospitals, to help them to make to produce electricity to run hospitals. So it's just a very basic what we are doing, because the needs in our partner countries are so basic.
Maria, thank you for that response. And I think that it's a very timely reminder that even though this virus doesn't discriminate, it finds itself affecting people in very different economic and social circumstances. And those of us who are fortunate enough to be in developed economies with very well-funded social safety nets can, as tough as it is, only recognize that for many of our fellow citizens, it's very, very much harder. And I'm sure we all recognize that the contribution that the German government through the BMZ program is making a tangible difference, not just to the quality of lives, but in many cases, I'm sure, to the maintenance of life itself.
Yeah, right.
Guy, I wonder if I may ask one of the questions for you now, and that is, how is the ILO going to maintain progress towards the 2030 goal for Sustainable Development Goal 8? Clearly, in some senses, the world itself almost feels as though it's been knocked off its axis, and programs with ambitious targets like Sustainable Development Goal 8 are only going to be so much harder to achieve. I know that you're an optimist, but I'm very keen to know how is the ILO going to keep progress going, and is that 2030 target, in your view, still attainable?
Yeah, I think being an optimist is a duty in these times. Can I just sort of preface my answer to your very difficult question by just saying how important that reality check that the Vice Minister just gave us really is. You know, what we've seen during this pandemic is the consequences of our policy failures over decades. You know, the fact that 6 out of 10 people in the world make a living in the informal economy, we always knew it, and we've done very little about it. But the result of tolerating that situation is that these people, we reckon that 1.6 billion working people now, are faced with imminent destruction of their livelihoods and a true humanitarian catastrophe. And these are the realities that we're facing. And I do want to come back with thanks in passing to the BMZ for everything they're contributing to this notion of international action, because it speaks also to where we go with the 2030 agenda. You know, we calculate that about $10 trillion US has been spent by governments across the world in COVID-19 response, 10 trillion. 88% of that has been spent in the advanced countries for the advanced countries, averaging out about 5.5% of their own GDP. The developing and emerging countries have been able to spend about 2.2% of their GDP. And obviously in absolute terms, that's a great deal less. And the least developed countries hardly figure, the needle hardly moves. And here is the mismatch between spending capacity, if you like, in mobilizing and spending resources, and the needs, because the needs are where the resources are not. And there aren't too many solutions to that problem. We have to get the international dimension in. We have to go much further on debt relief and financing for development. All of these, I think, James, are the preconditions for addressing the 2030 agenda. Now, we've got a call to make on the 2030 agenda. And I think the call from the United Nations is we're still pursuing the 2030 agenda. The reality at the end of this year, probably, will be in a significant number of the goals, not just goal number 8, but a significant number of the 17 goals will be pushed back before the starting line. We'll be in a worse position in 2020, end of 2020, than we were in 2015. And that's a pretty shocking and worrying reality. The second shocking and worrying reality is even if we didn't have a pandemic, even if COVID-19 had never burst upon us, we were way off course. This is in the Secretary General's recent report on SDG progress. We weren't getting there. The 2030 agenda is a deliberately transformative agenda, and those transformations were not happening. Not in terms of employment or youth employment, not in terms of health, not in terms of education, not in terms of climate change. We were off target. So I think the wrong conclusion would be to say, okay, we'll deal with COVID-19 and then we'll go back to what we were trying to do before it. Partly because we've lost time, partly because we weren't getting to the right answers in any case. So that sounds like lamenting a very difficult situation. To some extent it is doing that, which is the easy thing to do. But what do we do about it? Well, the ILO can contribute to this. And by the way, it's really encouraging to hear everybody talking about the need for dialogue across the world of work. It seems to be one of the consensuses that's been built up or strengthened, let me put it like that, by the pandemic. We've also, in the ILO, through the adoption last year of our Centenary Declaration on the Future of Work, set out some of the major challenges and answers. How do we cope with the digital transition, which might be accelerated by the pandemic? I recognize it. How do we deal with the ecological transition, where we know we have to do so much more? The demographic transition, all the rest. And we have an agenda for investing in people and their capacities, investing in the institutions of work, and I just want to linger on that for a moment, and then investing in the jobs of the future. Now, I'll make as my last comment, listening to the different ideas that we all have about what the new normal might look like and how to make it a better normal. And I'm hearing a lot, and I've heard it again today. Well, in the light of the experience of the pandemic, maybe just because of the experience, maybe because of what we will have to do in the future in the light of the pandemic, we're going to be moving, the dematerialization of physical workplaces, remote work becoming a norm, even the rethinking of the employment relationship. I mean, this is out in the air, isn't it? And we know that the technological enablement of these things is very powerful. But think of this. Just imagine, I've said that this pandemic revealed the absolutely dramatic gaps in social protection. Nobody in the informal economy, or very few people, have social protection. So when they can't go out to work for a day because they're locked down, their families don't eat. Okay, that's one end of the spectrum. But look at this, and it resonates with this future normal that we're talking about. What about the gig worker? The gig worker sitting in a loft in Manhattan Island. That person didn't often have access to social protection because there wasn't an employment relationship. There wasn't a clear legal status for that type of new job. Many independent workers, so-called, have suffered from this problem. So if we're going to a new normal, we've got to take the institutions with it. We built so much in the world of work up on the existence of an employment relationship, a physical collective workplace, that if we dispense with all of that, we're thrown back, whether we want to or not, on some of the basic issues of organizing the world of work, which has taken us over 100 years, James, to get to grips with, and it's been hard work. So I'll leave it at that as food for thought.
I feel like you've set us a very great deal of homework there, Guy. And reflecting on what I see close to hand, these are the very same concerns that employee representatives are raising in their engagement with employer representatives, including my own organisation, over what the possible social and employment arrangements might be going forward. And certainly I'm seeing, as many are, I'm sure, that the future is crowding in on us now. And I think we're also hearing that we're going to accelerate into some things like digitization, like it or not. it's going to be a challenging time is a strong sense I get from your comments, Guy. Another question which I would like to direct to Monica, to you, is a question. So how ready do you think companies and leaders are for this transformation that you in particular and we are talking about? Are companies and their management actually ready for this? We talk a lot about retraining and skills development, and that's often focused on employees, not so much the leaders of companies or the organizations themselves. How ready are we for this?
I think not all the leaders, private or public, were ready to this. Some companies were ready, but in general, we are facing a reset of the world. We didn't imagine that we were going to face this acceleration of new models of work. The good part of this, if we can say so, is that we have fight for many years against some stereotypes of how jobs should be, of how leaders should lead. And this reset everything. So it's a great opportunity to adopt these new models. Now it's less important where do you live, where you look like, if you are a female, if you have kids, if you are tall or handsome or pretty or whatever. The important things is that you are productive and you have the skills that we need in this new job. I think that leaders have a new responsibility, if I may say so. They have, as Johnny said, to educate their people in terms of what is fake news or good news, to lead by example in terms not only in digital adoption, but in following the protocols. I think they need to lead by example in living the purpose and the ethics and the values that we need to set in this new model. And companies should change from being consumers of work to builders of talent. And it's not just a matter of investment in trainings and education. Yes, we need to do that. But also individuals need to be conscious that if they do not learn, they will be out. It's not just a responsibility of the companies. It's everybody's responsibility. Governments, international organizations, companies, leaders, and individuals. For sure, we need to reinforce the dialogue among all of those people. For sure, we will face some social crisis in some countries more than others. But at the end, we need to be conscious that that's the new reality. I don't want to say the new normal, because the normal is going to be temporary. We don't know if we will face another pandemic or I don't know. But what we need is to learn, to adapt, and to adopt digitalization as a new model.
Thank you, Monica. And I know, for example, in Australia, governments are putting more funding into accelerating the digitization of small and medium-sized enterprises in order to help them have a better chance of competing and surviving in a more uncertain and competitive world, where being able to conduct business in a digital environment is going to be the key to success for a lot of employers. And then hopefully they'll be looking for employees with those skills, which means an investment in digital competency becomes really important, and may in fact become a threshold issue for a lot of people entering and wanting to survive and thrive in the workplace of the not too distant future. Johnny,
and if I may add something, yes, very quickly, is that the other side of the coin is that we need to work faster with educational systems and models, because we can't track things in a different speed. All what we said for many years about how education should be, how the careers should be planned, it's completely changed. as the world of work. And we need to tackle that in another session, I think.
Yes, this session is certainly generating a lot of questions rather than necessarily answers. But I think that's what we have to ask ourselves, these hard questions, if we're going to come up with the solutions that are going to make the most difference and accept the kinds of challenges that Maria and Guy are pointing out to us. Johnny, I'd like to go to you now. A particular question is, I guess it's where the rubber hits the road. And so how is an employer, in your view, meant to handle a situation where on the one hand, the employee needs to be in the office to actually carry out their work. At the same time, they have to be looking after their children because the schools are closed.
Yes.
Now, this is a reality facing employers and employees right around the world in practical terms. In your experience, how do HR professionals, how do managers handle that kind of dilemma?
So it's interesting. That's a great question because we know healthcare workers, largely that work, although you have telemedicine, a nurse who works in an IC unit must come to work, right? And because at least in the United States, most of our nurses are women. You know, it's a female-dominated profession, and they therefore are more likely to have to deal with the childcare issues. It directly impacts the first line response, let's get that right, first line responders. So what we've learned is two things. That part of it is on the employer side, we've seen some employers say, we will pay for your childcare, or at a minimum subsidize it. Because it is that important to have you at work, and we understand that you can't be forced to make a choice between your family and your work. They're inextricably intertwined, your obligations to both. And so we have seen employers who have the ability to pay for it. Secondarily, though, and I've found it very interesting, some employers have said because they rely on a significant population of people with children, they are now opening their own child care centers, if you will. Employers are allowed where you have extra space. I've literally seen employers rent space, hire people to come in and provide services, particularly for younger children, and they have all of the right PPEs. They're essentially camps, if you will, especially during the summer. And the idea is we think that will continue through what would have been traditionally school camps that will now morph into what we do in the more traditional school season, the fall and the spring. But that's what employers are doing. Interestingly, we've seen something that I'm quite fascinated about, and that is encouraging the community to step up. And so two examples that have begun to catch fire here. One, for college students, many of them who now are not returning to school in the fall, many of them were education majors in college. People are reaching out to them and asking them, will you at home provide for my children every day? So we will pay you, and in some instances employers are compensating them, but we're saying the community is rallying around and saying, you know, I'm going to provide a place for my children to be during the day. Some young person, generally young, who's home from college with nothing to do, they've been taught how to teach, they're younger in age and can be active, etc. They're saying, you know, a small group of parents will say, will you watch this group of 5 children during the day for me? And we all pitch in and pay. And it's sort of a win-win, because that college student who thought they would have an internship or thought they'd be returning to their college campus now can earn money and use some of the skills that they have learned while in school. So the community is rallying around to create fixes, if you will, at least temporarily, while we're in this situation. And we're seeing more and more of those sort of creative working moms are saying, I'm going to be home anyway. I'm sorry, women who work from home normally, don't work from home, but are stay-at-home moms have said, I have one kid, and they'll reach out to someone in their neighborhood and say, and you have one, drop that kid by every day. And now my kid will be able to interact with them. You can go to work and we'll trade off on the weekends or in your day off. But we're seeing both the community itself come up with solutions, and we're seeing employers do what employers do, and that is pay for it or provide a forum and pay for it, where their most important and critical employees have options. Because what we know is if employees are forced to choose between family and their work, you really put them in a tough dilemma, and it's not one that's sustainable.
I think that many of us on this call, ourselves or members of our immediate family, are having that same experience at the moment. And in some ways, it's probably reminding many of us of what things are like for people who don't have the privilege of power and authority and control as much as many people do. Look, we'll come to the final question, and I apologize to those of you on the call who have put in questions and we haven't had a chance to get to them, but I hope you'll agree with me that we've heard such a range of perspectives here and such significant points being made that we're all going to go away from this discussion maybe not a lot happier, but certainly a lot wiser and aware of the significance of the challenge in front of us. And this question I'd like to put to you, Alexandre, and that is thinking in your role as the head of an employer organization and your role both nationally and internationally, with all of these things that employers could do, should do, ought to do, would like to do for their employees. At the same time, of course, many of them, particularly if they're in the private sector, are simply struggling to get from day to day and survive. They've got bills of their own to pay, overheads, rent, interest and such. How then can employers manage their responsibilities to their employees, which have changed so much in such a short period of time, at the same time themselves keep going so they can keep providing jobs in one form or another? From an employer organization perspective, how do you think that challenge can best be met?
Thanks, James. First of all, I would like to say thanks for my panel colleagues for the substantial interventions. I was thinking about what Vice Minister Maria Flachbart said, and also Monica, about, we are facing different perspectives in different countries. People are suffering a lot, but in different ways. For us in Latin America, can you imagine? We were, before the COVID-19, the informality here, it was about 50 to 60%. Can you imagine what is going to happen in an immediate future with this increasing of informality, with our difficulty, to put the jobs, to recover the jobs? So, in fact, I think we are trying to adapt. I like it when Monica said about the reskilling, about the different perspectives. And I think it's not so easy. You lead by example if you don't survive. So what we are trying to do now is to find out the best perspectives to enterprise, just to move on. I don't have much to add, but I insist, James, that we need to think about the transitional measures for the post-COVID-19. And it means that we have to work together. We have to put our best effort coordinated on that. I mean, the government have to do the government part. We have to do what we can do being employers, and workers have to think about how to find different ways to work. You know, we are not talking about, I think we are not talking about jobs, but we are talking about work nowadays. So we are facing something different every day. Here in my country, for example, we are facing some huge problem that is when you have to think in perspective of rationality. We are discussing political and ideological ways to find a solution. It's not possible. So when I'm talking about we have the real tripartite with the real social dialogue, we are talking about that we have to be commitment all the parts of this engineering form. James, I think, as Monica said, that we have to change our mind to find maybe not a better normal, but to find a way to put us on the track again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I hand back to Roberto for the next session, as well as thanking our panelists again for their time and their insights and their honesty, and also all of the participants for your engagement, your comments and your questions. Can I also acknowledge the German Embassy to the UN and also Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for the support you've given to us to enable this dialogue to take place today. The event simply wouldn't be possible without that kind of thoughtfulness and support. And I hope very much that you can see that your investment has paid dividends in terms of the quality of this discussion. And I'm sure the inspiration that it will leave in all of us. And finally, Roberto and Errol, can I thank the IOE again for giving me the opportunity to play a role in facilitating this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. I should have said at the very beginning that right now is midnight in Melbourne, and James really committed already a long time ago to moderate this panel in very hard work conditions, I would say. The input has been great from all of you. Really thankful for this rich input for our next action-oriented, I want to insist on that, activities in IOE. So now Shay Gopal, she is our representative in New York, doing also a great work there, representing us, but also helping us also to connect with many UN institutions. But perhaps one of the main drivers of our future activities is how we as the private sector liaise with the resident coordinators. And that's the theme of the next discussion. Shay, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As an introduction to this panel, I'd like to give you some context. IOE addressed to the UN leadership in early April 2020, a letter in which they stated that they really wanted to engage with UNRCs in the context of UN reform, the decade of action, but most importantly during the COVID-19 response. Chief among IOE's attributes are its global representativity of businesses, large and small, across all sectors and in almost 150 countries. Experience, expertise in socioeconomic policy advocacy at the international level and then on the ground, and in-depth knowledge of the specific challenges and needs of local communities is really a key asset that we bring to the table. So based on these common objectives and outcomes, IOE, with the support of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, embarked on an initiative of bringing the UNRC's employers together to engage, advocate, and implement the decade of action through partnerships and collective impact. On May 20th, and then again on June 17th, we engaged with 9 RCs, 8 employers federations, and interactive dialogues to bring the parties together, and many of whom were meeting for the first time to mutually share and compare and come up with ways of engagement at the country level. So based on those dialogues, there are some key takeaways already, and we are going to put together a guide, a toolkit for both RCs and employers' federations. But some of the key takeaways, and my esteemed colleagues will give you more information on this, to achieve the SDGs, PPPs are absolutely critical. But a new multilateralism approach is needed, which strengthens the dialogue between state and non-state actors. The UN and the private sector speak different languages. We heard this umpteen times. And they need to familiarize themselves with one another, but then they need to meet and have a dialogue. The UN should step away from funding and financing approach and move to an investment approach. It's very important that we make sure the SDGs are attractive to the private sector and they see it as an investment with a return on investment. The UN has a powerful role to play as a convener and insurer against risk with its reputation and extensive network. But new approaches require new ways of thinking about the role of the UN. The private sector should not be viewed only as a source of funding, but rather as a genuine partner. They can bring expertise, innovation, technology to complement the work of the UN. Employers, federations, and organizations are key in negotiating policy changes, legislative frameworks that are necessary to tackle the many systemic changes we need. But in order to do that, we need to also embrace working with SMEs, a huge potential and opportunity in all countries. And we need to hear from them through our employers' associations. And there is a need also to back and forth between the UN and the companies to realize that there are potential benefits for PPPs. Now, lastly, to really stress, and I'm speaking on behalf of the many employers' federations that were part of these dialogues, their request, and they requires the following: a robust official structure, so that employers are involved from the planning stage to implementation. There needs to be a better coordination between the UN agencies. ILO is well known. We work closely with them. They understand employers. But others, often engagement is very ad hoc, and it depends on personalities and is not always consistent. At the country level, there are barriers such as corruption, informality, poverty, and lack of government coordination. These are significant, and for employers, these need to be addressed. Lastly, the employers, large and small, are keen to engage with RCs and the UN and welcome these dialogues that we've been having, and we are going to have 2 more, so that their members can work together to build back better and stronger, both for our communities, but not just for their shareholders, but for all stakeholders. So with that background, I'm really honored to have to introduce our panelists. So each one of them are going to speak, give some introductory remarks, and then they are going to be having an open dialogue between themselves. So first is Christian Salazar-Volkmann, the Regional Director for Latin America for DCO. We're delighted to have you here this morning, and you have the floor. Christian, you have the floor. Christian, are you there? I did see, I think he got disconnected. So maybe we'll start, if you don't mind, Siddharth, can we start with you? Siddharth Chatterjee, who is the UN Resident Coordinator of Kenya.
Can you hear me? Sorry, this is Christian.
Oh, Christian,
Hello?
great. Happy
Oh, I'm
that
sorry,
you're...
yes. I don't know what happened. I had to reconnect, so I'm ready, so sorry.
Go ahead, you have the floor, Christian.
Thank you. So you can hear and see me well now?
Yes.
Okay, so You know, a few words about the socioeconomic impact of COVID in Latin America, to give in the Caribbean as a specific example, and then a little bit about partnerships, if I may. The latest projection of the World Bank, the ILO, and ECLAC in our region says that Latin America and the Caribbean is the region in the world that will be hardest hit by the recession caused by COVID-19. And so we fear that after decades of growing prosperity, an economic recession of unknown dimensions will really lead in our region to massive unemployment, as mentioned by a previous speaker, also increased poverty, inequality, and violence, and that will reverse really some of the great achievements of the region in terms of the SDGs, but also previously of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. So we see a risk of moving into a situation where COVID-19 could propel us 10 or 20 years backwards in terms of the social economic progress in our region. And so in that context, I will not go, we have quite a lot of projections and data, which for time reason I will not cite, but in that context, I would like to highlight the serious vulnerabilities that middle income countries and small island development states in Latin America and the Caribbean are facing due to COVID-19, because in the past months, it has become crystal clear that the socioeconomic vulnerability of societies is not solely determined by the level of per capita income of a country, a lens that has traditionally led the UN development system, but also by other factors, such as the size and level of external integration of key economic sectors, the extent of people working in the informal sector, the level of inequality in society, climate disaster vulnerability, the dependency on remittances, and the debt burden. And so many of these vulnerability factors are especially present in middle-income countries and in SIDS. And at the same time, this group of countries faces huge barriers to access fresh money to confront the pandemic and to mitigate its socioeconomic impact. Hence, a key feature we currently discussed right now amongst the resident coordinators in the region is the urge to review the criteria for ODA allocation, debt relief, and access to capital markets, so that mixed middle-income countries and SIDS can get better access to the finances they desperately need to address the looming recession. As you know, across the board, the fiscal situation of the states has been weak before, and it will be weakened further right now. So there is very little space really in state budgets to expand a response. And so we, to bring in a first proposal, we would very much welcome a dialogue of the RCs of Latin America and the Caribbean with the private sector of the Americas on specific needs and possibilities of mix and SIDS in Latin America and the Caribbean related to investment needs and related to access to financing in the context of COVID-19. So perhaps IOE and Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and the German government, this constellation supporting here. As you know, Germany has a renewed partnership strategy for Latin America. So a good framework. Maybe you can help with such a dialogue, which we think is urgently needed. In many countries of our region, I'm proud to say we already have excellent partnerships between the UN and the private sector. Not that a lot more can be done and that it can be improved, that there are many issues, but we do have good examples. So we feel we have a very good basis to intensify and expand these partnerships across the board, while we are now, and we'll be tested on these partnerships as the region is entering the largest economic crisis basically in decades. So to confront a crisis that is as complex and multidimensional as we see everything that's coming out of COVID-19, we need a whole government, whole society approach to minimize the negative impact of the pandemic and to maximize the opportunities also that such a crisis offers. And so, as we know, and has been mentioned by you also, Shi, in the introduction, the decisions taken today will have long-term impact on the business environment and on society at large in our region and other regions too. For example, issues like tax reform, universal social protection, labor rights, or transparency and anti-corruption are on the table. And so it is important that the private sector and its associations engage with the RCs and particularly with the governments, of course, in the first instance, in the process of shaping the socio-economic response to COVID-19. As we speak, RCs and UNCTs all over the world are currently developing their response plans to support states and societies to confront the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. These plans are based on a global framework that captures the UN's experience of what works and what doesn't from previous epidemics such as Ebola and previous economic crises such as the global financial crisis from 2008. And in luck, we have 30 countries and territories right now that are finalizing, in the process of finalizing these response plans, and they have available detailed vulnerability assessments that determine country by country who are the most affected by the pandemic. And reading through these plans, these draft plans, one can already see opportunities for concrete engagement of private sector in linking, for example, economic recovery to green investment and digitalization, including informal workers, migrants, refugees, and other marginalized groups and the national social protection schemes, or revaluing the work of care providers in the health sector and other services of social care. This is a little bit in short. I would like to end just with one more brief topic. We are detecting a very fast growth of gender-based violence in Latin America, as well as in all other parts of the world right now. And so one issue for partnership and increased attention by governments, but also by CEOs, is the consequences of lockdowns and a large recession on violence against women, its impact on workers' productivity, capacity to innovate, deliver services. We do have in Latin America very good experiences of collaboration of the UN and the private sector in this area, the He for She campaign, the Gender Seal. There's a number, I know a number of corporate social responsibility projects for girls and women who are victims of violence in a number of countries. So I think we should expand them, and we should urgently work together to scale up these and other initiatives to kind of reduce and mitigate what we're seeing in terms of increase of violence against women due to COVID-19. So I leave it at that and ready to go a bit more into detail in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That was excellent. So now I'm going to give the floor to Siddharth. And just to say that Siddharth, Kenya is considered a best practice when it comes to the UN working with partners and particularly with the private sector in achieving the SDGs. But from your perspective, what are the challenges, but also successes in building these types of partnerships? Siddharth, can you unmute?
Yes, I can. I was just struggling a little bit with the mic. All right, so let me start from the very beginning. Back in 2015, what the UN family did was partner up with 6 companies, GlaxoSmithKline, Safaricom, Huawei, Kenya Healthcare Federation, Merck, and Philips. And we focused on the 6 most marginalized counties, which had the highest maternal mortality ratio in the country, which essentially meant that these 6 counties had kept Kenya at a maternal mortality ratio of 488 deaths per 100,000 live births. Now, this is pre-MDGs, so or this is during the MDGs. So the MDG requirement was less than 170 deaths per 100,000 live births. So we went in with this partnership, and we found that in a matter of 3 years, we were able to reduce the maternal mortality ratios by 1/3 in these very counties, which then led to us getting invited to 2 World Economic Forums. We were then in 2017 with the government of Kenya at the UN General Assembly, we launched the first SDG public-private partnership platform, which was launched by the foreign minister. And essentially, this was what became the launch of what Kenya did. Today, this platform has close to about 25 international and local companies, trust funds, financial institutions, etc. And the entire platform is driven to ensure that Kenya can accelerate and leapfrog the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, why did we do this? It was clear that the old world of aid is no longer relevant, and that context is changing in many parts of the world. And given that Kenya was also moving into, had already moved into a low middle income country, we felt that as the UN, we had the ability to convene, connect, and catalyze. And this is what we did on the ground. which is what led to this particular and very unique partnership platform to come into place. So as a result, what we are now doing is we've created a new development financial architecture in order to improve effectiveness, quality, and the impact of the real-time development cooperation. So this platform brings in governments, it brings in the private sector, it brings in the UN, it brings in civil society, and it is co-chaired with the government of Kenya. I think from a challenge perspective, the biggest challenge was there was no precedent. So we didn't know where to turn to. It was learning by going along the way. Most important thing was that we were able to ensure 3 P's converged. The first P was political will, which was at the highest level. The second P was we were able to shape and frame the right public policies and influence those public policies in favor of these kinds of partnerships. And third was really building real partnerships of this sort. As the Deputy Secretary General often reminds us, we need to flip the orthodoxy, and this was precisely about flipping the orthodoxy. The greatest challenge was, however, from within the UN system, because the UN is not used to this kind of programmatic approaches of looking at scalable models of public-private partnerships. So it was also about making sure that the entire UN country team, the leadership of the regional directors, and all the way to their principals understood this was about flipping the orthodoxy, about doing things differently. And I think the UN reforms have actually helped us take this forward in a much more effective way. We needed similarly like-minded donors, and we found governments like the Netherlands and the US and Switzerland and Sweden looked at this as a way to come together in order to advance the spirit of multilateralism through the spearhead or the vanguard of public-private partnerships, where we could look at go away from the issue of funding, go away from financing, and as you correctly said, Shia, bring in the whole component of real investments, where the UN provides precisely those platforms, the intellectual firepower to convene, connect, and catalyze. So we had the primary healthcare center, where we invested about $15 million. That turned into a $120 million public-private partnership enterprise. We've similarly in the agriculture sector on food security and nutrition, we brought the Ministry of Agriculture, IFAD, FAO, and a range of private sector partners together to unlock the real potential that Africa has. It's $1 trillion enterprise by 2030 in Africa. How do we get ahead of the curve? We've established what is called the National Advisory Board for Impact Investing in Kenya. So this is really very much UN-led, UN bringing all the key partners together. So what we've managed to do is really reframe the narrative and the strategic positioning of the UN in response to precisely what the UN Secretary General expects of his UN country teams, a UN which is fit for purpose, delivering as one, and looking at goal number 17 of really catalyzing new partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. And now I'd like to move on to Krishnan Sharma, who is the Chief Strategic Engagement Unit Chief, financing in the area of financing for development with UNDESA. So, Chris, we know that many argue that finances and resources are the key to the implementation of the SDGs. But how is the UN engaging with the business sector to scale up private finance and investment for sustainable development? Chris, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Shea, and thanks very much for inviting me to this meeting as well. You're absolutely right that achieving the SDGs requires a significant scaling up in finance and investment. I think estimates amount to trillions of dollars per annum. I mean, from now on to 2030. So how do we achieve that? Public investment, of course, remains important in a number of cases, but it's far from sufficient. It's very important in that respect to scale up private finance and investment for sustainable development. Having said this, though, private finance right now rarely flows to areas where it's most needed. And it's often also short-term in horizon. And what's very important, especially if you want to factor in sustainability factors, climate change and so forth, is to have long-term finance and investment. So, I mean, the flow of funds framework really looks basically at the impediments now facing a wide variety of private actors in terms of scaling up finance and investment for sustainable development. On the far left, as you can see, are the sources of funds. On the far right are the outcomes. Obviously, this framework would vary from economy to economy, but it provides a start that we can build up on. There are four key actors that we really have to look at in terms of their incentives and impediments facing them. These are institutional investors, financial institutions such as banks, both commercial and state-owned, non-financial corporations, and very important intermediaries in the capital markets such as rating agencies, brokers, and so forth. Ultimately, what determines both the quantity, the quality, and the term horizon of investment really are the incentives facing these actors, not just the individual incentives, but the interface of these incentives. Let me give you an example. Institutional investors are often cited as a major source of funds for sustainable development, especially long-term investors like pension funds. But if you really look closely at pension funds, they only invest about 3% of their assets in infrastructure. And there are a range of reasons for that. I mean, including fiduciary responsibilities, including, regulation, including the fact that many of them don't have the capacity. They often outsource their funds to short-term investors such as hedge funds and so forth. Let's move on to companies. The corporate sector has been making, prior to the pandemic at least, record amounts of profits. But this has rarely translated itself into sufficient amounts of longer-term investment. In fact, the profit to investment ratio has in fact been moving in the wrong direction. And once again, there are reasons specific to companies for that. Including, corporate governance factors, long-term metrics facing investors and so forth, quarterly reporting and a variety of factors. But ultimately, if you want a complete argument, you really have to look at the interface between all these actors. So if we have data and charts showing that, since the 1970s, there has been an incredible increase, in the proportion of institutional investors sitting on corporate boards as shareholders of companies. And so naturally, what you would find is that the incentives facing institutional investors, especially short-term investors, translates into the incentives facing companies. Likewise with banks, likewise with capital markets. I won't go into this in depth due to lack of time, but we have in fact papers and reports outlining this. So we really need to tackle incentives facing a range of private sector actors, which will determine both domestic investment and also foreign investment. So what exactly has the UN been doing about this? And what are the key policy implications? The policy implications, as I said, are incentives facing financial actors, incentives facing non-financial actors, and beyond that, a range of risk mitigation mechanisms, because even if the incentives are right, there's still high risks in developing markets in particular. And finally, pricing and externalities. To look at all these in a holistic fashion and to address this problem at the source, the Secretary General's established an alliance last October called of 30 CEOs from across the world, ranging across both the financial sectors and non-financial sectors, called GISD, the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. And, and it was formulated in last October. And this alliance is really driven by four key working groups. The first group looks at the incentives and how do you scale up long-term finance and investment, looking at the incentives facing each of these actors. The second group says, even if you address these incentives, how do you ensure that capital flows to countries and sectors where it's most needed? It's moving the money. So it looks at platforms, risk mitigation tools and instruments, platforms whereby investments can be pooled into sustainable development sectors. The third looks at measuring impact. So often we liken this to a cake, in fact. Group one is about increasing the cake. Group two is about slicing the cake properly. And group three is about enriching the cake and enhancing the impact. And now we've formulated a fourth group, which we felt was important in its own right, which is how do you enhance long-termism across both the financial sectors and the corporate sectors. Now what's recently happened is that the COVID-19 pandemic, however, has thrown, I wouldn't say it's thrown a spanner in the works, but it's also forced a lot of the GISD CEOs to also rethink and try to refocus on issues that are of greater importance, reorganize some of these issues. So in fact, we had a joint statement signed by these CEOs last June, focusing on 5 or 6 major factors. Firstly, that they would work with the broader corporate sector to try to better integrate the SDGs into core business models. Secondly, that they would accelerate the development of platforms, tools and instruments to better channel money to sectors where it's most needed. Thirdly, that they would sort of work with policymakers to better coordinate international financial regulation. It's felt that sustainability imperatives rarely find their way into regulatory bodies and standard setting bodies. So they would use their collective influence to work with policymakers and regulators to try to draw these factors in. Fourthly, they would work with credit rating agencies to try to, because credit rating agencies are very important intermediaries, signalers in fact, to try to increase the long-term horizons of credit rating agencies, and also encourage them to incorporate a greater degree of sustainability criteria, both material and to a degree possible non-material, into their ratings. And finally, that they would also work with policymakers to the degree possible to ensure that externalities are better priced in to policies. In terms of, as I mentioned, GIST was formed in October last year. In terms of what it has achieved to date, firstly, it's worked on a definition of sustainable development investing, because the key thing is that anyone can claim that I'm investing in sustainability areas. So it's tried to work, among the 30 members, they've agreed on a definition of sustainable development investing, and their job now is to spread this among the wider business sector and among policymaking entities. Secondly, they're working on platforms, developing platforms to channel finance to developing countries and sectors. They've also at the same time developed, in fact, a guidance on the issuance of COVID-19 bonds. How should these bonds be issued? How do they take the SDGs into account? What are the critical factors? And finally, right now, they're holding in-depth consultations with the European Commission. The European Commission has a major consultation on its high-level sustainable finance initiatives, looking at central regulatory issues, a number of which I've mentioned before, dealing with incentives, dealing with bank regulations, solvency regulations, international platforms, and so forth. So they're collaborating with the European Commission to provide a central input into the framing of regulation in the jurisdiction. The next annual meeting, the GIST, now the term horizon of GIST was initially 2 years. Now it's likely to be 3 years, because really addressing deep set regulatory issues takes a longer period of time, as recognized. At the same time, they will have an annual meeting with the Secretary General every October to take stock of what they've achieved and where they will head. The next meeting is in October this year, and that meeting will be critical, in fact, of framing out the roadmap for GIST over the next 2 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krishna. So now we're delighted to have a member state speak, and we haven't had the dialogue with member states in our previous dialogue. So we're delighted to have Courtney Nemiroff, the Deputy U.S. Representative to ECOSOC. So Courtney, the governments have supported the reform of the UN and the whole development system with a view to improving its coherence, efficiency, and impact. Mm-hmm. This reform is now being tested by COVID. And we'd like to know, how do you as a member state feel, how is the UN reform actually assisting in these early days of COVID, and particularly in the recovery?
Okay. Thanks so much, Shay, and thanks to the other panelists for these really thoughtful presentations. I'm going to go through my points very briefly. Actually, I'm going to make them even more abbreviated than I would have otherwise, because there were so many issues that the other panelists have surfaced that I think deserve quite a bit or as much attention as possible. And we can kind of weave reform into that as needed. Well, first of all, I think the long and short of it is that the reform is already working well. And we are hugely supportive of the Secretary General's ambition and the leadership that the RCs are already undertaking in terms of COVID response and recovery planning. We were a big proponent at the outset of UN reform well before COVID began. And as it turns out, reform has come at incredibly, is now gearing up at one of the most important times in the UN's history. We believe strongly in the principles of UN system coordination and enhanced coherence, and ensuring, as I think Sid mentioned, ensuring the system is fit for purpose and drives measurable impacts. And most importantly, that the results serve people on the ground, because that's who the ultimate customers are, not the delegations here in New York. And I think the example of what is happening in Kenya right now that Sid is undertaking, and some of the projects that Christian mentioned, are a perfect example of that. Public-private partnership is very much at the essence of transforming not only the system, but how it's doing its business and how it is drawing on and maximizing resources to get the results we need as quickly as possible and in the most comprehensive manner. So for the US's part, we contributed $23 million to the RC system last year, in the new RC system in 2019, and we just re-upped that contribution for 2020. We're the largest member state contributor at this time. And these funds are not only paying for DCO, RC, but also RC office staff salaries and budgets. And they're really a signal of how much we value the coordination and our belief that, that now is the time to do these things. And we want to encourage other member states to step up to the plate and contribute to put this system on the sound financial footing that it needs to go forward and make long-term decisions. Our expectation is that the overall system is going to continue to break down silos. Not only silos within the UN country teams, silos in terms of coordination across the whole system, from the headquarters level to the regional platforms, and break down and expand cooperation with stakeholders like the private sector. We feel that RCs are going to be, and already are, more strongly positioned to address the humanitarian development nexus and ensure that UN programs are consistent with national goals, strategies, and priorities. Based on the analysis of real-time dynamics in the country. And I think Christian already gave us a good sense of that in terms of the data that they're collecting and synthesizing for use in making decisions about planning going forward for COVID recovery. And I also just wanted to touch a little bit on early evidence of reforms assisting response to COVID. First of all, we've been completely impressed with the way RCs have not only connected quickly with resources that are being offered at the headquarters level, but how they've been working with each other to mutually support each other on the ground. And this has been very important because we're in a whole uncharted territory right now, and we have to be learning by doing in real time. So hats off to RCs in the field and their teams who are really on the front lines of all of this with their national partners and key stakeholders from the private sector and civil society. We think that the system overall has done well to provide policy guidance to RCs and to support an RC-driven process. We have also seen a good amount of joint programming among UN agencies, funds, and programs. And I'm sure some of the other panelists can speak to some of the specific examples of that. And we understand that the country teams broadly have coalesced around the RC in COVID response. We've heard anecdotal evidence of, business as usual is well past over now in the space we're in now. And that's really fantastic to hear. And then finally, on the socioeconomic side, we see that the Secretary General's Trust Fund focused entirely on funding RC-led and coordinated responses. That is absolutely the right thing to do. We've got to put the resources, the tools in the hands of the RCs to be able to make the decisions. And part of that too is tapping in not only to UN, traditional UN resources, but also into other pots of money across the broader system, including through the World Bank and regional banks and of course through the private sector. Room for improvement. Obviously, we're in the early days. The system is still adjusting, particularly at the field level, and it's going to take some time to fully realize a response that fully maximizes reforms. And we want to give that space. More can be done, I think, to support the independence empowerment of the RCs now, particularly in COVID response, by the member states and by UN system actors. And we're going to have some work to do this fall in the QCPR, the quadrennial review in the General Assembly on this. And overall, our expectation is that, and our hope is that the full range of development actors, including private sector and employers, are able to play a full role in response and recovery. Thank you so much. I look forward to the questions, and I have many questions for the other panelists as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Courtney. So now I'm going to open it up to the panel to ask, make your comments or your questions to one another. And we also have some questions that are in the chat box for Sid and for others. So maybe I'll start with you, Christian. Comments, questions to your panelists. The floor is open to you.
Well, my question is actually back to you because how do you see such a proposal to organize a dialogue as a follow-up to this meeting to discuss this partnership, private sector, in this moment in time, and where are the opportunities? I think we can dig deeper in something like that. I'm asking this because also coming back to Courtney, through the reform, it's the first time that we really have consistent capacity to link with the private sector. Every office now in our region, as well as another region, has a partnership officer, a development financing and partnership officer. So actually a body, somebody that can kind of do the detailed work you need for a sustainable partnership. And in my office, in the regional office of DCO, the Global Compact has now placed their regional officer to support those partnership officers, but also to increase the link with the local networks of the Global Compact. So there are a number of new areas which allow us not just to kind of have a conversation, but to follow up. And so it's sorry to put you on the spot, but it's a question to you if something like that, because there is an urge in the region, we're very clear that this is a super complex crisis. And the private sector, we have a lot of political polarization in many countries. Achieving consensus is difficult. And so this partnership, many RCs bring the private sector, is key in that moment for society overall in our region. So such a conversation, I think, would have many positive impacts. So that would be kind of a little comment and question to you.
So thanks for that, Christian. And just to sort of say, you're absolutely right that there are structures that are being put into place to address how do we work with the private sector, et cetera. But given our two dialogues that we've had, I'm not sure that all these people are in place and people understand those structures. And so we've actually heard, and you gave the really good example of gender. One of the comments during one of the dialogues was, who do we go to? There's UN Women, and then there's ILO doing the work, and then there's UNDP, but who's actually the person we should be speaking to? Because we've done a lot of work on the gender issues. So the structures, the focal points, the people, a lot of the employers' federations and associations don't know who to go to. That's number one. And you say that, and this is coming up in some of the questions as well, what are sort of the channels for these public-private partnerships and how do you get this going? But it has to start somewhere. And so through these first dialogues, there were 3 or 4 employers federations and RCs who had never met, and now they're meeting. So I think that's progress and that's action, and that's great. But one of the things we want to do is based on these dialogues, and the next one will be in Spanish, including all our colleagues from Latin America, and then there'll be one for Francophone speaking countries. The idea will be that we come up with a toolkit or a playbook on engagement and what are some of the key things that both employers and business organizations need to know, and also what does the UN and a lot of the RCs need to know about working with the private sector. Now, as I said, Kenya, they know how to do this. But when we've spoken to some of the RCs, they were like, we know, particularly during COVID, this is absolutely critical, but we don't always know who to reach out to. And employers' federations are not always known, especially for the UN people that are working in some of those offices. So we're going to do a playbook. We're going to do additional dialogues. And then we want to bring in Global Compact as a knowledge partner because they have excellent information. But as they don't deal with policy and system change on the ground, we want to partner with them, particularly in places where there are no or very limited local networks, because as you know, the Global Compact has networks, but they're not in every country. Often they're actually housed in our federations, but we want to work with them, but also with DCO at the global level, because we've written to them and we feel that actually it would be great if we could get across the board all the RCs knowing our interest in working together. So I think there are some next steps, and we'll certainly be consulting with you on that. So maybe I'll give the floor to Sid.
Yeah, seriously, I just wanted to kind of make a quick comment and a big thank you to Courtney, because last year in November during the UN General Assembly, with Ambassador Shoret Shalit, we launched the SDG Accelerator Lab, which brought together the Rockefeller Foundation, the Center for Global Action in Berkeley, UC Berkeley, ourselves as the UN, and the government of Kenya. And this was the first of its kind which was launched at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And the purpose of this was really to catalyze the big data, technology, and innovation in order to leapfrog the development agenda in Kenya, which was followed in January actually with a visit to the Silicon Valley. Right now, there are 17 companies from the Silicon Valley that want to join the Kenya UN SDG platform, and we are going through what is called a due diligence process. But one of the most beautiful things that has happened as a process of this engagement, which has also been happening with the Google folks, with the Stanford folks, was the launch of the Google Balloon recently in Kenya, which is about providing internet connectivity in some of the remotest areas in Kenya. And this has just happened. So, it takes a lot of work of keeping the momentum on this going. And therefore, I've also been having discussions, Courtney, for example, of what the new profile of an RC should be like. And I think we have to be far more entrepreneurial and knowing the language of how to bring public-private partnerships onto this, because I think the real added value of the UN is as a de-risking agent, as a risk mitigator, bringing all the key partners together and catalyzing it for action. So a big thank you to the US government, in particular to your ambassador here and Shoret in New York, for actually having been an enabler of this.
Krishna, there is a question for you. Would you like in the chat box? I'm not sure if you'd like to maybe answer that. It's concerning incentives for institutional investors that represent a challenge for achieving the SDGs. what are the regulatory reforms that are necessary to really build creative, responsible investment environment that enable investment to flow towards realizing the SDGs based on a foundation of respect for human rights, in line with human rights responsibilities of investors and their portfolio companies? Would you like to address that question?
I can certainly have an attempt, and I too have a question as well for the others. Shall I do both together? Sure. I mean, in terms of reforms in the policy and regulatory space, I mean, that's still something that, you know, people have different views on. I mean, if you were to ask me personally, my personal capacity, I think we need to look at, you know, regulatory reforms that incentivize companies and investors to think more long term. I think that's critical. Once you start thinking more long term, then you draw in more sustainability factors into account. There's a raging debate about existing reporting systems in much of the industrialized world, which focus to a great degree on quarterly reporting. And there's a good rationale behind it as well. You have to hold them accountable. But at the same time, is there some way of having a rolling reporting system, a bifurcated reporting system, whereby companies are also held to account on the longer term sort of investments? Should you have, I mean, this is an open question, should you have sort of regulation mandating companies, mandatory regulation, asking companies to sort of release information about the investments, about what they're doing in the area of sustainability? Should you perhaps rethink, I mean, you know, some of financial regulations, including bank regulations, solvency regulations, and also the broader sort of standard setting regulations to incorporate longer term sustainability considerations into them? Should you work with credit rating agencies to try to improve improve the subjective word, increase the term horizon of ratings from 3 years to 5 years? These are all things that are being discussed. I'm not going to say it's easy, because every decision has a byproduct effect. But these are things that, you know, we are encouraging GISD CEOs to sit down, in fact, with policymakers and look at objectively, dispassionately, taking into account different conditions in different countries. So that's the first one. On this, in terms of my questions, thanks. I really sort of enjoyed all the presentations. I just have the question, I mean, and it's really to all the participants, but perhaps particularly Sid, and, you know, but it's relevant to everyone. It's about where public and where private. I mean, and that varies. I mean, you know, in terms of countries, there are still areas where public investment may be important because it captures social externalities, and other areas where private investment is very key. And very importantly now, what about the hybrid of the two, public-private partnerships? I'm a great believer in the strength of blended finance and PPPs in terms of raising resources. That being said, we actually brought out a major paper a few years back on PPPs, looking at their record and what can be done. And as you all know, to a degree, their performance has been mixed. Now, this should not be seen as a problem with PPPs per se, but more in terms of the way they've been implemented. They've been shown to be more effective in some sectors than others, especially in economic sectors, in telecommunications and so forth, less so in some of the social sectors where investors have found it hard to sort of capture the externalities. At the same time, there's also an adverse selection problem here. For PPPs to work, you also need an effective public sector. And the adverse selection in that is, it's often countries who have very weak public sectors, who are yearning for private investments, often want to have PPPs, and as a result, they often end up getting designed very poorly with large contingent liabilities, poor risk sharing, poor transparency. So my question really is that, you know, when we're sort of trying to sort of build up PPPs and sort of, you know, spread them, which is a very important thing, are we also looking closely into how well they're structured and also which sectors that they're particularly appropriate for? Thank you.
So thank you. And I'm just conscious of the time. We need to wrap up in the next few minutes. So maybe I'll give the floor quickly to Sid and then on to Courtney.
You know, Krishnan, I think we've got a very good example in history with the Marshall Plan, which the US had in Western Europe post Second World War. It is actually the most classic example of PPPs which really took shape and transformed Western Europe from 3 points of view. First of all, it took Western Europe out of poverty. Second of all, it created a new market for the United States. Third of all, it created a whole new group of allies. And I think that's a very interesting model to be applicable for, let's say in Africa today. You know, John Donne once said, no man is an island, every man is a piece of the continent. We are in that situation where today governments just don't have the money, given the COVID crisis with millions and millions of people who are getting trapped into poverty and, you know, going in for unemployment benefits. This is the time where the UN can actually rewire the entire economic ecosystem and look at large-scale partnerships, because the private sector needs populations that are able to survive and thrive and have the incomes, because the whole concept of too big to fail has been taken away by this COVID pandemic, which has been ruthless. I mean, you know, the biggest companies, we are seeing the reinvention or the renaissance of John Maynard Keynes's concept of economics coming back. So I just think that now is perhaps the time for us to revisit historical legacies and what does it mean for a renaissance of the UN system itself, to take this whole model and convene governments and private sector and civil society to make that dramatic change that we now need to see.
Okay, thank you. And Courtney, some final words?
Amen. I completely agree with Sid on this. And Krishnan, I wanted to come back to incentives for the private sector. I mean, this has been kind of a thread that's been pulled through here. Incentives for investment, but also what are the incentives and how does the system make it easier for the private sector to plug in? Not only on specific partnerships, but in dialogue. And we definitely take good note of the work that the Secretary General is doing on the GISD Alliance. I would say that one thing that has to happen now as part of the recovery planning process and engagement at the national level is for RCs to have the ability to access specific resources connected to decision making, that they can help national governments on decision making with respect to regulation, transparency of regulation, predictability of regulation, and where possible, streamlining it so that the private sector can do more and engage more. There's a parallel effort going on by the major donor countries who are also major business partners in many, many developing countries to get that message through. And I think what we need to do is come together with national authorities and businesses on this to have a more integrated conversation rather than sort of having these separate conversations. And it has to happen now. And so I very much appreciate the work that DESA, DCO, and the RCs are doing on this, and just know that our embassies on the ground are also completely supportive of that more integrated conversation with national authorities and stakeholders. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, unfortunately, we need to close up. But as another sort of action item for me, I'm going to keep the dialogue going between you, because this is all of you, the panelists, because this was excellent. And it was really great to hear the back and forth. But unfortunately, our time has run out. So I would like to thank all the panelists, because it was really an excellent conversation, but also to Andrea from the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for their incredible support, and the German mission, not only on this event, but also in our project and trying to bring employers closer to the UN. So thank you very much. And I give it back to Roberto.
Thank you, Shay. Very rich panel, very dynamic conversation, and again, very action-oriented. We'll look forward also to keep engaging with you. I have now to give the floor to Matthias Storms, the Deputy Secretary General of IOE, on a theme which is also closely related to private-public partnership, and also with the collaboration between the private sector and international organizations, precisely in this moment of post-COVID or COVID-19, which is human rights and business. We have also distinguished panelists, but I give the floor to Matthias to present them. Thank you so much. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Yes, indeed, it's the last panel, but it's a very important panel. We will focus on the UN Guiding Principles. The June 2021 will mark the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles. As you know, they are the authoritative and globally recognized framework for business and human rights. And it is a good occasion, this 10th anniversary, to take stock what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what we need to do better to implement this important framework. I'm very happy that with us is Dante Pesce, who is the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and who is leading this project of the UN Working Group. The UN Working Group is about developing a roadmap for better implementation of the UN Guiding Principle, which they will present next June to the Human Rights Council. And we as IOE are very keen to engage with them and to guide them in the development of this roadmap. The aim is not and cannot be to renegotiate the UN Guiding Principles, but the aim is really to focus on what needs to be done better in order to amplify, in order to escalate, in order to replicate best practice around the world. With us also two company leaders, Brent Wilton and Linda Cromyong, one from an American company, one from an Asian company, who have directly experienced in the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles within their companies. And with us is Gabriela Rick-Herzog, who is representing the US State Council for International Business, the US member of IOE, but who has also a career in government as well as a career in the company. So it's a perfect panel to address this important issue. And the aim on the question we will raise is whether the UN Guiding Principle have changed state and business practice. What are specific best practice examples? What are still remaining challenges? What we need to do better. So with any further ado, I would directly turn to Dante Pesce, who is, as I said, leading the project of the UN Working Group, to explain a bit what the working group intends to do, and perhaps already whether you have very first impression in which direction you will go. Dante, over to you.
Thank you, Matthias. Many thanks for the invitation by IOE and Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and the nice welcoming words by Matthias Thorns. This high-level dialogue is very timely for what I would like to share with you. Last week, we had the launching of our new Working Group on Business and Human Rights project, looking after a decade of global implementation of the guiding principles. We count with the valuable support of the German government, but also the ILO, OECD, UNDP, the EU, and a full range of stakeholders from all over the world, including business and especially IOE. We are trying hard to break down silos. I want to piggyback on some of the last week's words from our chair, Anita Ramasastry. We are in a turning point. We are in a turning point and inflection point for the future we want. It is a future of closed borders, armed conflict, rising inequality, climate crisis, pandemics, and discrimination. Or is it a path of resilience, inclusion, justice, peace, and prosperity? As we reflect, there are two key commitments already made by states that are fundamental. Both recognize the responsibility, the responsible business is a key part of the solution. The first is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that set for the aspirations we have for people and planet. And we welcome the call from the UN General Secretary for a decade of action. And the second are the guiding principles. Regarding the SDGs, we want to start by signaling that Goal 17 is an invitation for a new alliance for sustainable development in which state and non-state actors are of critical need, followed by Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. We need good governance. Strong institutions are fundamental to think about addressing all other goals and targets. COVID-19 crisis is a reality check of our global and local capacity to prevent, mitigate, and respond to a crisis. Is the same capacity or lack of it that we have to respond to the inequality crisis or the climate change challenge, etc. The second global agreement is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, brought to life by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And the universally accepted framework to how to realize corporate respect for human rights. grounded in international human rights and labor standards. Their three pillars tell us what is needed. States must protect human rights, business should respect human rights, and when harm occurs, victims need access to effective remedy. In the lead off to the 10th anniversary of the Guiding Principles in June next year, we are undertaking this new project to, first of all, take stock on the first 10 years of implementation. We have made progress, and we are looking after and collecting examples on at least 4 dimensions: societal expectations, the regulatory wave, business-to-business expectations and requirements, and investors taking business and human rights on board. And second, we're designing a roadmap for action in the decades towards 2030 and beyond. We'll be building momentum towards June 2021 and be able to provide strategic direction to all stakeholders regarding goals, targets, and a wide range of accompanying measures. At the minimum, we'll look after linkages towards 2030 goals, but also linkages towards 2050 goals and hopefully beyond. Our goal is to help unleash the full potential of the Guiding Principles to support our collective efforts to achieve the future we want. Regarding the process, we are dedicating 1 full year to listen to all stakeholders from North and South, but also West and East. I myself, as project lead, are part of the Global South, based in hard-hit Chile. We need to move from pockets of innovations from governments, business, and multi-stakeholder initiatives to speed up and scale up. We need to listen and learn from people affected by business negative and positive impacts, listen also and learn from policymakers, and listen and learn from business, both leaders and followers, big and small, and all in between. We don't know better than the practitioners on the ground. That's why we're dedicating a year to listen. We want participation from the design stage of the project to the practical implementation of their outcomes. We're looking after evidence-based solutions. We have initiated this process of listening already, starting by consultations with business associations, including IOE, USCIB, ICC, Global Compact, etc. On July 28th, we'll have a consultation with IOE leadership and its executive team, and our planning engagement with in all regions with national employers associations. What we have heard so far: genuine interest in engaging into this process by all stakeholders and institutions already mentioned it. Recognition of the value of social dialogue to create solutions that can be implemented realistically and incrementally. Need a global and local enabling environment for responsible business conduct to thrive by strengthening institutions in all levels. Need from governments both political will and policy coherence expressed in a smart mix of policy measures, but also and at the same time avoiding unintended negative consequences, disinvesting from risky business environments, for example. Need to think about sexy high-end innovations, as an example, application of technology, including their risks, but also less sexy but urgent innovations to address the SMEs challenges, the informal sector, and business operating in weak institutional environments, etc. So finally, I would like to thank again this invitation and to make possible this engagement to be taking place and to happen. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Dante. That was very comprehensive, and it already gave some indications where are the problems, where are the challenges, informal sector, the government zones, and so on and so forth. I would like to turn to Brent Wilton, Workplace Rights Director at the Coca-Cola Company. Brent, you are, of course, very much engaged in the implementation of the guiding principles within Coca-Cola, but of course, you also have been very much engaged in the drafting of the guiding principles in your time in the IOE. So could you explain a bit what are the successes of the guiding principles? Because I think it's important already, and also to look at what we have achieved in the last 9 years, what are remaining challenges, and what you think needs to be done for the next decade of action. Brent, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and the IOE for the invitation. And thank you, Dante, for your introductory words, because I'm going to call on a few of those as we go through my few comments. The UN Guiding Principles have been a game changer. I think we have to recognize that, in that it has put human rights into the debate more than at any time previously. For me, it has also put to bed the issue of corporate social responsibility to the extent that the UN Guiding Principles have very clear pillars of responsibility. And so the pillar for business to respect is very easily articulated in the UN Guiding Principles. Some implementation challenges remain, but the idea behind it is very, very clear. I think it was also very timely because it is now something that we are also relying on as a company as we look at some of the challenges that are emerging on COVID around the world and how we respond to them. Some of the gaps that I see at times are the fact that the connection between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 isn't as strong at times as I'd like it to be. We've always talked about the fact that it's easier for business to operate in an environment where rule of law and all the requirements of good governance are in place. And that is not always the case. And in some instances now we're seeing a deterioration of that. And Dante mentioned that in his comments as to what sort of future we're going to have. So I think there is more need to have that conversation with governments about fulfilling their responsibility in actually protecting the human rights of people, because that makes it a lot easier for business then to do its work to respect. We face challenges in some countries where that is lacking and the expectation on business becomes very high. We're almost asked to act as government, and we can't do that. We don't have that social legitimacy. So I think that's a big area where we need to do some improvements. The other is the SME sector, which Dante also mentioned. I fear still that after 10 years, the conversation around the UNGPs circles around the Fortune 500 companies. If you look at all the benchmarking that's done with regards to human rights, it's all aimed still at very large companies. And that also makes it difficult for us as we work through supply chains. It would be easier if governments were also helping by articulating clearly to their business community what Pillar 2 means, so that when we have connections with suppliers, they actually know what we're talking about. In too many instances, there's not enough knowledge of the UNGPs out there and tools to help smaller business manage it in a way which can make for meaningful engagement through a buyer network of a supply chain, but also to help improve further the aspects of human rights within a community. Because again, if you're just as a company trying to do it, you can put a spotlight on a small piece, but you can't shine the light on the whole country. And I think it's very, very important that we think about how we deal with that going forward. So those are my two big ones, really. Grievance remains a challenge for everybody, but I believe now that what I'm seeing in some of the discussions, we're moving away from accusatory discussions to more partnership discussions. I think everybody, be they civil society, trade unions, governments, business, have all recognized that no one's got a silver bullet on this, and that there needs to be greater collaboration and understanding around how grievance needs to work in a particular environment, pulling in, for example, local human rights commissions and others, and the law enforcement processes and the courts to make sure that we're actually coming up with something which is meaningful, low level, speedy and efficient for people whose human rights have been interfered with. One of the other things for me too, as I look at the UN Guiding Principles, is the fact that we need to do more collaboration around the implementation in some very difficult environments. And we talked about weak governance zones, etc. That's a very difficult place for business to operate on its own. And there again, that partnership, and I listened to a bit of the earlier panel about that partnership with the UN, is so important to find ways to actually be able to be effective in those environments. The next 10 years, well, I'm shocked that it's 10 years already. It ages me quite considerably. But I think Dante's approach, I think this time now is right and fit for purpose to look at where we want to be in 10 years with the UN Guiding Principles. There is a lot of talk coming out of the European Union about a regulatory framework on HRDD, etc. That could actually be helpful. so long as it is flexible enough to recognize that the world is not one sort of supply chain or one sort of business, but it can also be an impediment to people's willingness to start to go further with the UNGPs. Is this what we should be doing, or should we wait for something else to come along? And I think there needs to be some clarity around that, because what I've found is that the voluntary nature of the UN Guiding Principles certainly helps a company to be able to operate its human rights work in such a vast variety of different environments. Our brands are in 207 countries. That's 207 separate realities. And I'm a bit concerned about how a regulatory framework that some are talking about will actually be operational in some of those environments where we work, whereas the voluntary approach enables us to adjust and work with the various stakeholders we need to create the sort of environment to respect human rights. I think John Ruggie, when he started work on this back in the early 2000s, probably had no idea where it was going to end up. But I really do believe that the future of the UN Guiding Principles needs to be ensured. I think it has been very, very useful. The work that Dante and the whole group are doing there in the UN Forum each year, all of those things have it's like water on rock, have slowly started to broaden the engagement, but we need to do more to make this known to more people. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. And water on rock is a good point. There's a question from Farooq from Bangladesh, whether there's a possibility actually to make the guiding principles more known by asking all UN member states to take one comprehensive plan to promote them. I will come to that, Dante, in a minute. You can think about it because the question was directed to you. I will turn now to Gabriela.
If I can just say, it's a bit like the national action plans. They're an opportunity to do that more constructively, and I think we need to think about those again in a different light. Sorry, I'll go mute.
No problem, stay unmuted, because it's a very good point, of course. And as we have seen, the national action plans on the guiding principles has been disappointed in a way that they've also started in Europe, then some other country followed, but not so much following at the moment. Gabriela, I would like to turn over to you. The members of USCRB are the biggest enterprises in the US, I would say, more than 300 global companies. They have huge supply chain around the globe. What are the challenges these companies face when they implement the UN Guiding Principles, particularly in the supply chain? Brent already spoke to it a bit, but if you could give us a broader perspective, that would be great. Over to you, Gabriela.
Thank you so much, Matthias, and to IOE and to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for this opportunity today and this very important discussion. USCIB and its members helped to create the UN Guiding Principles so many years ago. We were one of many stakeholders at the table involved with Professor Ruggie and his team, with civil society, with academics, with governments, and we're very pleased that we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, and it's right and important that the UN Working Group has developed this 10-year look back and look forward ahead, because as Dante put it well, the UN Guiding Principles are recognized as a universally accepted framework for business and human rights, and USCIB and its members as well enjoy and appreciate that same perspective. It is receiving our full support and through demonstrated action from our members in terms of work every day to work to implement UNGPs in their operations and through their business relationships. It's the framework, Ruggie in his wisdom, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise it took 6 years, because it was an important discussion that was robust, that was comprehensive, and that landed on a balanced approach, which was why it has received so much support in terms of the duty, first and foremost, of governments under international law to protect the human rights of their own citizens in their own countries. The responsibility of businesses to operate with respect for due diligence, with respect for human rights, and to operate with due diligence and to know and show in terms of their risks and their responses. And then the need that we all agree for greater access to remedy for alleged victims of corporate related harm. So how are we doing after 9 years? I see 3 general buckets of challenge, but these areas are also opportunities. First, you know, the good news, I mean, we have definitely seen the uptake as has been described. It's been integrated over at the OECD, in the G20, in the IFC. We see national action plans taking place as well, and a growing number of those. In terms of demonstrated implementation, USCIB and its members have participated every year at the annual gathering, the UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, to present and share experiences and seek input. And there are many examples on this panel and beyond of companies working to integrate the UNGPs in their operations and their policies and standards at the headquarters level, and then through implementation through their operations at the field level. Despite the fact that we have so much happening, certainly with large companies like our members, as you know, Brent pointed out, we still don't have enough companies embracing the UN guiding principles as their own responsibility as well. I don't know that state-owned enterprises have been mentioned yet today, but that certainly is an area across a range of corporate responsibility themes, but in particular as it relates to human rights, where we all have more work to do. To engage with those governments as peers, engage with those companies to help them understand that it's in their interest. Not only it's right, because of responsibility for human rights extends to state-owned enterprises as well. Ruggie said it in the UNGPs: every enterprise, every location, irrespective of the size. But in terms of size, we also have challenges with the SMEs. And COVID rightly has highlighted the critical role that SMEs play. They're the backbone of our global economy. They are the majority of business. But as it relates to the UN guiding principles and implementation, unfortunately, we don't see the uptake there yet. And we don't have all the answers. We need to collectively continue to see what can we do to be engaging at that level. A second area of concern or challenge has also been mentioned: the role of government. And the working group itself has raised this concern very clearly. And we know the data, the statistics are there. The ILO's own analysis of where are the majority of decent work deficits present around the world, it's at the national level, with small and medium-sized enterprises producing for national consumers, not tied to global supply chains, the overwhelming majority. And we've got that data. We've got that data from the ILO on where those decent work deficits are. The Walk Free Foundation has a global slavery index, and in 2018, they found that only 7 out of the 12 G20 countries were taking action regarding modern slavery. The U.S. Department of State just put out a trafficking in persons report last month in June. It's their 20th edition. They've got tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3, where with a lengthy report showing the challenges. The Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor, has their forced labor and child labor reports, which also show and make recommendations. This last version had over, I think it was like 1,900 recommendations to governments on actions they need to be taking. But the role of government is key. It's key for Pillar 3, for access to remedy. Strong institutions. It's key for SDG 16. The role of governments and implementation at the national level is key. Let me just wind up with a third challenge, which I think is just, the need for dialogue and the need for collaboration. There is, we have to find a way to reduce where we're seeing it, polarization in this discussion on business and human rights. There remains skepticism, but there remains also a lot of bright lights of opportunity, where Stakeholders have come together with assumptions about the best of intentions about each other and found ways to deepen dialogue. I'm hopeful. Collaboration is key. As Dante pointed out, evidence-based results that can be magnified and amplified are key. But this question of, pillar 1 or pillar 2, when I talk about governments, it's not an either or. It's not to replace the focus on business, it's to add in also and make sure we're not losing sight of that fundamental piece, which is on the government side. I look forward to more conversation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriela. That was really comprehensive. Really appreciate it. Linda, you are the lead for human rights in the Korean company, and for us it was very important not only to have the European and US perspective, but to get a global perspective, and of course Asia plays a crucial role here. Could you tell us which role the guiding principle plays within Samsung?
Yeah, thank you, Matthias, and thank you, IUE, and thank you, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, for organizing this panel. As you said, Samsung is indeed an Asian company, but we've got a worldwide footprint. The far majority of our people is working outside of Korea, but still with a strong presence in Asia. And maybe just one additional component to add here is that Samsung does produce the far majority of our products in-house. We've got huge manufacturing plants. What I did in preparing for this session is really looking back into the history of what has Samsung done, say, with regards to human rights and UNGPs, and what was the journey there. And looking back, I think the journey started in 2007 when the decision was made to join the Responsible Business Alliance to find, say, a common code of conduct and a common due diligence process for our own operations as well as for our suppliers. And UNGP served already, when they started as an accelerator. They not only influenced, I would say, the Responsible Business Alliance journey and our journey, but many of our journeys today, and also heavily influence our internal agenda. And I want to share a few steps with you here. In 2013, we created our own internal function to monitor and manage the work environment of our own operations, which didn't exist before. In 2014, we developed an internal human rights risk monitoring system, didn't exist before. In 2017, and I look back into our sustainability report, it was the first time we explicitly mentioned UN guiding principles in our sustainability report. And in 2018, we conducted our first human rights impact assessment for one of our key operations as part of our due diligence process. And I joined in 2018, and probably that also would have happened if it were not for the UNGPs here as well. Last year, we conducted more supplier third-party audits compared to the years before, and we are still working, every year with our suppliers to improve their capacity, which is also linking back to Farouk's question here about how do we build this capacity. And this year, we're training all of our MPDs worldwide to make sure that they understand the labor human rights and they understand what UN guiding principles are all about. If you look into our policies, you can also see there, I would say, a gradual development and improvement about policies relevant for labor human rights. And very recently, beginning of July, we published a new child labor provision policy and our new migrant workers policies. But we also learned the hard way that, say, one crucial element of the UNGPs is engagement with our stakeholders. And we understood the relevance of that. It's not easy, but we're doing it and we're learning every day. I think UNGPs also drove very much transparency. Another angle of the UNGPs, you have to show what you're doing. Our sustainability reports, are one proof of that element, but also what we see happening within benchmarks. Benchmarks are a result of the UN guiding principles. We are progressing there as well. We were quite, I would say, it's a good starting point in ranking number 4 in the ICT benchmark on corporate human rights. And in 2020, we ranked number 2 in the Know the Chain benchmark. It's I would say, a good temperature check of what we're doing, about what we're performing, but also where we still have gaps to work on and to do better every day. And as already said, if it weren't for the UNGPs, those benchmarks would not have been there. Those investors would not have had that focus on the S of the ESGs in that one. I would say the UNGPs have been and still are a driving force to continuous improvement. And we are learning every day still what's the right balance. And I think it's also addressed by Dante, also by Gabriela and by Brand. What's the right balance between people, business, and our societal interest? And how do we make sure that we protect the human rights of our workers every day? I want to come back to the comment made. I think it was Roberto who said at the introduction about post-COVID-19. Well, for me, I still view we are in the midst of COVID-19. It's not over yet. We see, different stages depending on the countries that we operate in. And with COVID-19, I would say the UNGPs and also say the collaborative part of that one, I think only has gained in relevance. Finding collaborative solutions in COVID-19 in industry association and business associations, but also finding collaborative solutions in doing due diligence, even if you can't be on site, I think is really, really important as a response and an answer to COVID-19. I'm going to pause here now and hand back to you, Matthias.
Thank you, Linda. And you mentioned the benchmarks, which are, of course, an important phenomenon which we see more and more. We have a comment by Ryan who said that the World Benchmark Alliance actually is revising its methodology and invites everyone to give input. So everyone sees a link in the chat and you can give your input for that one. We also got a question from Paloma asking whether we still have the challenge of silo approaches in companies. And I would like to add actually to this question another one. How do we can link the SDG agenda to the UNGP agenda, right? This is by accident that we say the next decade needs to be the decade of action with regard to the SDGs, because 2030, of course, is the deadline. At the same time, we have the decade of action for the UNGPs. But apart from these coincidental 10 years, how in a company can we link both agendas together? And also directly asking or responding to Paloma, how do we can ensure that within companies, we don't have silo approach? Anyone wants to answer? Linda, directly?
Yeah, maybe just quick comment on the World Business World Benchmarking Alliance. Indeed, the consultations start online. We can also, join in on the weekly, I would say, consultation sessions starting as of next week. With regard to the siloed approach, I think siloed approach is still there. It's also still there sometimes within something. You need to work hard every day to overcome this siloed approach and explain continuously why it is relevant. And there, I think, and coming back to say the relevance of capacity building also internally within companies, that is hard work. And that's not something that one department can do. That's not something one person can do. That I think is continuous work in asking people to look in a different view, in a different way about what they're doing. Because it's not always the case that it's say a logical part of their thinking and how they in their day-to-day life and in their areas of responsibility. So a challenge, but I think an important focus to overcome, because that's the only way in say finding, I would say, solutions and doing better in there. And if I may, just with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals and linking those to the Human Rights Agenda, UNGPs, want to make the link here to the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. They have linked, say, all the indicators to the SDGs, so they're mapped. And for those companies who report on the GRI, say that mapping more or less, I would say, has been done automatically. And within Samsung, labor and human rights is very strongly linked to SDG 8. What else can you add there?
Perfect. Thank you, Linda. Gabriela and Brent.
Yeah, just if I can come in quickly. I mean, we have now, because of James Quincy's new vision for our company, which is refresh the world and make a difference. The make a difference part is really being driven around our sustainability agenda. And as we do more in our sustainability agenda, the human rights piece is more easily brought into focus. And I'd have to say that even 12 months ago, the silos that we had are now a lot less rigid than they were. And so I think that linkage is extremely helpful, because at the end of the day, if you look at the SDGs, a lot of them can be very easily articulated in human rights terms. So it's getting a lot better. I'm also finding that there is less resistance to some terminology. I know in the United States, there is this constant fear of expressions against interest and the liability that can come from that. But my boss has always been very open in talking about the company and where they're at. And I think that's helping drive an internal conversation as well.
Thank you. And Gabriela?
I think these are really important questions, and I want to thank Paloma, especially for hers. I mean, maybe to take the easier one, intersection of the UN guiding principles with the SDG framework. I mean, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, there's been a lot of good analysis that shows that they interlink, they're interwoven, and human rights carries out throughout the SDGs. For me, a key one, again, I'm going back to SDG 16. It begins with strong institutions, but all of the elements within the SDGs touch upon key areas of human rights, and I think they're part and parcel and one and the same. And hopefully, we don't have a siloed. We're going to get the siloed turf battle of, you know, who is getting more attention and resources, what, you know, the UNGPs or the SDGs are the hot new thing, and let's not forget about the other. They go together, and it's a cohesive priority for the global business community and for all of us. In terms of silos, you know, I've worked in government, I've worked in the private sector, I'm in association, nonprofit world, everywhere I've worked, you know, it's you know, it's appeared one way or another. As it relates to business and human rights, I do agree with Brent that the trend line is positive. I mean, I think the challenge is language. I'm thinking back to my experience inside a company and approaches to just listen and show empathy, to understand why is there hesitation if you're encountering a colleague or a business unit with concerns about these frameworks. The reality is the world decided. And oh, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't you personally, Paloma, or, you know, anybody here, it was the world. So if we can stop personalizing it and understand that this is the future, and listen with empathy to understand those who have hesitation, and work with care and heart to bring them along in the right direction, I think trend line is correct. And I'd like to you know, refer back to a dear friend, Judy Samuelson, from the Aspen Business and Society program, and she recently on LinkedIn highlighted a Harvard Business Review article, but she put a quote here: "The challenge facing management is not the lack of new theories, it's the strength of the old ones." And for us, for all of us who have dedicated our careers to advancing development and human rights and equality, we have to keep going. And I feel very confident with leadership and with this 10-year review of the UNGPs and key frameworks like that, and with colleagues around the table, we can make it happen.
Perfect. We need to come to an end. You see Roberto already switching on the camera, which is always threatening. So Dante, you have the final word now, because not only you have still the question to answer from Farooq about how to ensure the plan and the better outreach to SMEs when it comes to the UNGPs, but also perhaps 2-3 words what you have heard, and that all in, I don't know, 1 second. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. The specific response to Bangladesh. Actually, all governments that are represented in the Human Rights Council had agreed on a resolution making a call for all governments at national level to develop a national action plan on business and human rights. In the case of Bangladesh, there is work in progress right now, and under the lead of UNDP for Asia, based in Bangkok, there is a project that we are supporting with help from some donors to actually implement a race to the top and push governments and provide technical assistance to all stakeholders, but governments at the center, to develop their action plans. And Bangladesh is part of that equation. So happy to follow up on that. And there are some of my colleagues from the working group and the technical and the secretariat participating in this event. So please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. You could easily find us in the website of the Office of the High Commissioner, we're Working Group on Business and Human Rights, etc. So I will say be proactive, because this is a push that is aimed to reach the whole world and not only some in Western Europe and few others around the world, including Thailand and Asia, by the way, that has an action plan. I took note on a number of issues on the listening with empathy. I will say that that is key, and trying to wear the shoes of the people that actually are not evils, but are not there yet. And the ones that are working by doing and learning as they implement and they try hard to do things. So listening to the practitioners, wearing their shoes with empathy, I think is central. Regarding governments, and also something that Gabriela asked about state-owned enterprises, sure, policy coherence is not only by clarifying expectations and integrating business and human rights horizontally in the different government functions, but also as an economic actor and leading by example as a state-owned enterprise or public procurement agency or export credit agency are expressions of political will. And you don't need, in most part of the world, a legal reform to actually show that you believe in this. And at the same time that you pray or incentivize or call on the private sector to do X, Y, Z, there's no obstacle to get your house in order. And I will say getting the house in order strengthens the authority and the legitimacy of governments to actually push business in the same direction, but not expecting from the private sector to go beyond what you're willing to do yourself. There are a number of other elements that I would not like to touch because it will consume too much time. Only one point on the SDGs connection. Agree with what has been said. There's a number of connections between goals and targets and the fulfillment of rights for people. And as a working group, we published 10 points where the guiding principles on business and human rights are connected with the SDGs. So that is, of course, in the public domain. That is our starting point. What we say is responsible business conduct is a precondition, it's a requisite for achieving the sustainable development agenda and the contribution of business. And we have also said is that respect for human rights is indivisible, is integrated into responsible business practice and is foundational to it. And then the connection with us is also strengthening in the SDG agreement on the means for implementation, where the paragraph 48 or 68 explicitly references the guiding principles as lens to be used by business as the private sector crashes and thinks about its practical contribution to sustainable development. So it's actually part of the agreement to integrate business and human rights and the guiding principles as the lens for business to contribute to sustainable development. So it's really, really grounded inside the SDGs in itself. And for greater clarity, we have published this 10 points to add an additional clarity to this very fundamental question. And thank you again, Matthias, for the invitation.
Thank you so much for this great panel, and I directly hand over to Roberto. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias, also for efficient moderation, and also to all the panelists. Contributions and exchange really rich, and also helping and guiding us for the future. I now hand over to our president. Thank you also, Errol, for listening, also to be there. Also, we are waiting also for your closing remarks, and together with Andrea, the executive director of the Konrad Foundation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, from decent work to multilateralism, UN reform to business and human rights, we heard some very interesting dialogues that prove that much can be accomplished when we come together. We must work together and find innovative ways to come out of this crisis, and this together. Now is the time for bold action to meet the targets of the UN Decade of Action. We are pleased that the global employers community is ready to join forces with governments and the multilateral community to respond forcefully to this crisis, while maintaining and increasing momentum toward the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Let us now take action. Thank you for joining us today, and please stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Errol, again for your commitment with us. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, sincere thanks to all speakers of today's panel. This was an immensely enriching discussion. We have touched on many, many issues, but we also have to acknowledge that today's discussion took place in a quite a sobering context. Due to COVID-19, SDG achievements might be reversed. Many of the SDG areas will be worse by the end of the year compared to the baseline year. And we also have to acknowledge that not all can be blamed on COVID-19 and the pandemic. Yes, the agenda is transformational, and probably we have been a bit too slow, and some approaches have not been effective as they should be. But I think there are a few key points that we can take out of these discussions. And for example, when it comes to functioning of the economy, how to do business, one point that was mentioned was we need to move away from in-time delivery to just-in-case production. Beyond the creation of safe work environments, transparency, communication, education of employees are key aspects. But also when we look into building back economies, one has to see how to build back, particularly in resource-dependent economies, how can added value chains be built into the economies. When it comes to employment, yes, currently securing and creating jobs is at the forefront for governments, for the private sector, but we also have to ensure that there is a compliance with labor standards. Those working in the informal sector do equally need support. And also we have to look beyond traditional labor relations when addressing social protection. When we look at the engagement of governments, certainly they need to build capacity of SMEs. They should not only focus on big business, they also need to provide access to inclusive, sustainable financing. When we look into the relations of government, private sector engagement, yes, there is a genuine interest, there is a recognition of value within the social dialogue, and certainly we can identify key areas where this kind of engagement needs to be strengthened. It's technology, it's funding, but it's also youth and skills development, and it's human rights, as we heard in our last session, and particularly now in the crisis, we need to look into gender-based violence. But we also heard that tripartite dialogue needs the commitment of all parties. Quite often, particularly the politicization dilutes the dialogue, and political will and policy coherence are crucial elements for creating such an enabling environment for the dialogue. When we look into the UN private sector engagement, we have heard about many promising initiatives by the UN, particularly on macro levels, such as the GISD. We can see the fruits of UN reform for enhanced coherence and coordination. For the first time, we have a structure in the resident coordinator's office that enables the resident coordinator to engage with the private sector. And we have also heard about encouraging and inspiring best practices, as we have seen in Kenya. But certainly there is more need for dialogue between the UN and the private sector, but also between the UN, the private sector, and national governments, particularly when it comes to the legal and operational framework. And especially in very difficult environments, private sector also needs the UN partnership for its own advancement. We have also seen that the UN guiding principles can be a driving force for the private sector. When we look into the international cooperation or support that is needed, we still can see there is a mismatch between spending and where the needs are. Yes, the North is equally occupied with the health sector, securing jobs, support for the economic sectors, and strengthening international cooperation. But there's also the South that has beyond that needs for food security, stabilization of fragile states is an issue. We have states with displaced persons, and there is the whole issue of government liquidity. Also, the minister from Ghana mentioned debt forgiveness. and access to financing and investment. So we see a lot of issues on the agenda, and certainly it's now the time to invigorate multilateralism. We need a better level of cooperation that at the moment is not seen as it has been during the financial crisis when the G20 came together. Certainly when we discuss multilateralism in the context of COVID-19, we also have to look into regionalization of multilateralism, enhanced South-South cooperation. But first and foremost, we have to strengthen the rules-based multilateralism because also the crisis has highlighted the weaknesses in the system. So I think we have had a very, very rich discussion today, and it was encouraging to see such a multi-stakeholder discussion working out so well. And I would like to thank our cooperation partners very much for this very challenging and enriching endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. You have also done an excellent job identifying key points which can be followed up with some action. And we'll do a report based on this discussion, which can help us also to move the agenda forward. So thank you to all of you for participating. I also want to especially thank those who have been participating from Asia, who are still late in night, connected and also exchanging. So I just want to give a special thanking. And of course, to all the panelists. Keep safe, let's keep connected, and let's keep also pushing together the agenda that we need to push, which is the SDG agenda, but also the private sector, public sector collaboration. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.